The City of Toronto launched the 2024 budget process with a staff-prepared budget that protects core services and makes investments in transit, shelters, and community safety. The budget aims to set the city up to achieve financial stability and sustainability through a new multi-year approach.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Councillor Shelley Carroll, and I'm the chair of this budget committee. We do have quorum now, so I'll call meeting number 4 of the budget committee in this term to order. Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. So the purpose of today's meeting, let me just set this out. The purpose of today's meeting is to hear the overview presentation from the city manager and the chief financial officer and treasurer on the 2024 operating and capital budgets. The presentation that we are about to hear is now available on the clerk's public website at toronto.ca/council. So now I'm going to turn it over. The city manager and our chief financial officer, Stephen Conforti, are going to talk for a very long time now.
Well, thank you very much, Chair and members of the Budget Committee. Happy New Year to you all. And it is my pleasure, and I know Steve's pleasure, to be here today to walk you through the overview presentation. As the Budget Chief and the Chair indicated, today is about the overview and gets us into the conversation, which will continue in earnest next week, when you will have the opportunity to delve more deeply into the service areas and the various divisions that, of course, have all been working very hard to bring forward their operational and capital budgets for your consideration. So we're happy to take you through the overview, answer those questions today, and then my SLT colleagues who are all here today to answer general questions if necessary, but more importantly, to listen to the questions that may be coming next week as we get deeper into some of the services that we offer here. I want to thank Lauren for navigating us through our presentation today. You know, we often forget that might be the most important element of today, is making sure that the slides match up with what we're actually saying. So Lauren, thanks for that. But more importantly, Lauren has been instrumental in working with the rest of the financial planning team and all of SLT in making sure that this presentation today reflects the collective effort of the staff and our budget chief and the mayor that we want to bring forward. So without further ado, let's move in. We today are presenting and bringing forward an operating budget of just about $17 billion and a 10-year capital plan that is just shy of $50 billion. So if you look at that and just take an average of that capital piece, we're talking about over $22 billion per year that is invested in this community, in services and infrastructure that is critical to not only those who live, work, play, and learn in this city, but, as you all know, critical to the success of this province and this country. But the 2024 budget thinking really began a long time ago. It began with the 2023 budget, when we realized and became very aware that the COVID support that had been there during the crisis phase of the pandemic was drying up. And yet, in places like Toronto in particular, the challenges that COVID placed on this community were not going away in its totality. We can all agree that the crisis of the pandemic is behind us. Life has got back to a more normal and pre-pandemic look. But many of the critical services and supports that Torontonians rely on are still feeling the impacts. And as you have heard repeatedly, in particular when it comes to our transit service and when it comes to the way that we work and support with the most vulnerable in our community. Last year, we had to ensure that we had a backstop available in the absence of sustained COVID relief from the provincial and federal governments. And as we've gone through 2023, you have seen in the reports that Steve has brought forward and his team to you regularly, updating you on the position financially during 2023, we have been drawing from that backstop to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The impacts of COVID remain very real in this community. And as a result, we've needed that backstop to ensure that we could continue to meet our obligations in 2023. So that set up the challenge for 2024 of what do we do when that backstop is no longer available. In March, we provided you a snapshot and a look at through the long-term financial plan of what the issues Toronto was going to be facing over the next decade, but in particular also talked about the challenge in 2024. Yes, we're talking about a nearly $50 billion challenge over 10 years, but that is not spread over 10 years or something that we can wait 2 or 3 years to acknowledge. It was clearly identified that 2024 was going to be a challenge. And so in the summer and at the special council meeting in September, the long-term financial plan was discussed and debated by council. And through a series of recommendations, you approved measures that will kick in 2024 and will also have an impact on future budgets. And that also began the heavy lifting as we get towards today's presentation and launch of our budget process. It begins internally. Once we understood the impact of the long-term financial plan, we were able to give direction to our staff and have them build their internal submissions. As you know, there is a huge amount of work that happened within our divisions as they look at how they can maintain service and deliver service in an appropriate way to Torontonians. But one of the things that we do each and every year, which I feel doesn't get enough sometimes publicity, is the line-by-line review that happens division by division so that we can bring forward submissions that are the most efficient and effective as we look to deliver service. As you will see later on in the presentation, over $600 million of offsets or reductions have been identified, including $244 million that was identified through the submission process between September and October and November. That is the work of your staff. Not simply saying, well, just find us some additional revenue and we'll keep trucking on. It is our staff committed to continuous improvement and continuing to be efficient and effective in the services they deliver. The long-term financial plan kickstarted an intergovernmental approach, which, as we all know now, was done in a new and unique way when our mayor and the premier of this province decided that they would charge senior staff in both organizations to work over a 2-month period to bring forward ideas that could help build a stronger sustainability for the City of Toronto. It led to immediate and longer-term actions that directly impact both our operating and capital budget, and they have been included in our submission and our budget that we're launching today. That is a Herculean effort over a short period of time, done in a way that allowed us to ensure that we could make those changes and those additions to our budget in time for today. And so as you sit here today and look at how our budget was informed, you can see the various elements that I've described go into what we're doing today. We did want to maintain core services that are cut across the entire City of Toronto and maintain service levels. We did want to ensure that we took into account key investments that Torontonians have been endorsing through our public consultation, and you as council have been saying are key to what you see as the future of this community. Those are about how we move people around this community, how we deal with the issues of affordability, particularly when it comes to housing, how we support the most vulnerable in the city, and how we make Toronto safer. While we certainly did not go to each and every division and say, what are all the enhancements you could possibly want this year? Because this is not the year for that to occur. We did, in a strategic way, include some enhancements to services that will help this city. But at the end of the day, as we talked about in the long-term financial plan, this was never about one entity or one group of people or one body solving the issues that Toronto has from a fiscal sustainability perspective. Everybody has to play their part. And we're pleased that there have been institutions outside of the City of Toronto, primarily the province of Ontario, that has stepped up and is willing to do some help. We have more to do, and there's more work to happen, but we're very pleased with some of those efforts. We know our staff continue to work very hard each and every day to make sure our programs are delivered effectively and efficiently. But at the end of the day, there is a role for the property taxpayers at the City of Toronto. It is never easy proposing a residential property tax increase. We understand as staff, as much as you understand as our governing body, the impact that this has year over year on the people of this community. Today's operating budget tax increase is large, and we acknowledge that. But it is put in the context of what is above that bullet point on this slide. How we built our budget is important in terms of how we've driven to the number that's before you today. And we will, of course, talk about our capital budget later in this presentation and talk about the City Building Fund at that time. I do want to say to you that there is a point of disappointment for me in our presentation today. The disappointment is, as you can see from the presentation you have heard from the chair of this committee, we can offer you no specificity on how we will deal with the very significant challenges from a financial perspective and an operational perspective related to refugee and asylum seekers who are coming to this community. We have no confirmation from the federal government at this particular moment in time and in time for this budget presentation that talks about how we will deal with what is now beyond a relatively large piece of our budget. It is a huge piece of the budget. To do what we do, and the latest statistics that I had for this week is that there are about 5,800 refugee and asylum seekers somewhere in our base shelter system or in additional shelter spaces that we have opened up. It, on an annual basis, is about $250 million that we need to find to fund that operation. Put in another way, it's close to $700,000 a day. That means that on January 10th, we have already expended $7 million to support those who are coming to this country under incredible burden and under incredible pain and under incredible trauma. We want to be there to support it, and Toronto continues to step up in our operational efforts. But as of today, we have no clear sense of how we're going to support that. It is disappointing to me because this is not a conversation that happened in the last few weeks as we were finalizing our budget. About a year ago, we indicated to Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada that we were seeing numbers increasing that we felt were on a trajectory that would take us beyond the numbers that we had seen pre-pandemic. And yes, there was a convening of operational tables, and yes, there was an opening of line of communications, but at the same time, access to funding was closed down in the early part of 2023, and yes, reopened later in 2023, and we appreciate that, but nowhere near to the level that we need to deal with the challenges that we face here. The federal government, halfway through our process of the New Deal for Toronto, agreed to join the table. They heard at that table that one of our key operational challenges was around shelters. The province of Ontario recognized that and said from a homelessness perspective, that Toronto continues to deliver shelter services beyond that which any other municipality does, and acknowledge that in the New Deal that the Premier and the Mayor agreed to. $200 million a year for shelter. But they were clear, along with the City of Toronto, to say there is this additional piece when it comes to refugee and asylum seekers that the federal government must come to the table around. And yet today we sit here with no answer. The timing of our budget was clear to everyone, when we were going to launch and when this process is. And so is there an opportunity continued for us to hear from the federal government? Yes, the conversations continue, and we hope that we will seek and see some kind of resolution here. But it is disappointing today that we're not able to give you a stronger pathway on a budget piece that, as is noted in our materials, is the equivalent to a 6% raise in property taxes. And so the province of Ontario, who recognized our budget process, who provided us clarity prior to January 1st, who have been committed to flowing funding immediately to help our operating budget in 2024, I want to say thank you for not only recognizing the investments that are necessary, but recognizing the financial realities of our budget year and our fiscal year and how we need that commitment so that we can make the decisions that we need. And we hope in the coming weeks that we'll be able to thank the federal government for stepping up and doing the same. The next series of slides that I'll ask Lauren to leave up for maybe a second or two, and then we'll move on, really give you the background that you know about the role that Toronto plays in the larger context of this province and this country. We are an economic engine, and so as the province goes and as the country goes, so Toronto goes and vice versa. We are a necessary part of the economic activity that is going to be necessary as we head through this economic period for the next couple of years that we hear from all of the economists. As we move to the next slide, You know, as we talked about in the long-term financial plan, that some of the unique challenges that are confronting us in 2024 are the confluence of just a number of things. The hangover of COVID, the issues that have to do with interest rates, and the issues that have to do with inflation, all coming at us at the same time. And so as we deal with all of those issues, it challenges us on a budget front. As we move to the next slide, you've heard from me that we continue to step up. And that is a credit to you as our governing body, and it is a credit to the folks that work in the Toronto Public Service who then act and implement on our directions. We continue to provide a variety of services that go beyond that which we are, legislatively required to deliver. And we do so because those are the kinds of things that make this city livable, that make this city the beacon that it is around the world for people to emigrate to, and for the people who are here to strive to be a part of for a long time. And talk to you about how we do a stronger job of multi-year approaches to understanding how we can plan for the future of our budgets. But more importantly, it isn't about those black and white numbers on the page. Whatever our budgets are is about how we will deliver service to this city. So with that, I'll turn things over to our Chief Financial Officer, who has just done an amazing job this year of balancing what are a series of ever-competing priorities. You know, the old joke is that every budget year is the worst budget year. And the problem with saying that every year, and this is for me, my 14th municipal budget across 2 municipalities, is that sometimes, that becomes a joke and just a line. You know this year that this is true. This is one of the toughest budgets that I've been a part of. I've talked to Steve, and he has lots of experience of budgets, and he said the same thing. So Steve, over to you. Job well done, and take us through the rest of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And before I start, I'd like to extend my thanks to our budget chair and budget committee members for all your support throughout this process. And we know there's still a few weeks to go, and there's going to be a lot of meetings in the next week, so looking forward to that and the continued support from all of you. I think everyone here appreciates the challenge that is the 2024 budget. And I'd also like to take a moment to extend my thanks to staff across the organization that have supported budget development and helped get us to the point where we are today. This includes Anthony Ng and our team in financial planning, Lauren Birch, and our supports in the CFO's office, and all the finance leads across the organization where we have worked closely with, and that includes Annalisa Mignardi, Marco Cuoco, Alan Cohen, and Vivian Xing, and all of their respective teams to prepare the 2024 budget. Collectively, we're now ready to launch a balanced budget that, in addition to New Deal funding, bridging strategies, and increases in property tax revenues, has found over $620 million in reductions and offsets. So as reflected in this slide, we have prepared a 2024 combined tax and rate-supported operating budget of $17 billion in total expenditures. We've known for some time that 2024 was going to be a challenging budget. We have noted the looming significant pressure we were expecting to face for almost a year now. In fact, with all the 2024 program budget submissions, once they were all submitted and collected, the final opening budget pressure totaled an unprecedented $1.776 billion. This was greater than our initial estimate of $1.5 billion that was developed about a year ago as part of the long-term financial plan outlook. Driving this change to our initial estimate was the significant added demand on our shelter system, especially as it relates to the demand for refugee claimant response, as well as additional costs associated with service and safety investments in our transit system that began last fall. While we've had opening pressure similar or even greater than the nearly $1.8 billion pressure over the last few years, I note that this pressure is unprecedented because unlike the budgets during the pandemic, there is no remaining Safe Restart agreement or further expectations of COVID support funding to cover our sustained pandemic-related impacts. One of the key pressures that we're facing in 2024, beyond our traditional structural deficit and our annual inflationary and growth-related pressures, is the need to transition costs to our property tax base. associated with the remaining $578 million in sustained pandemic-related impacts on our transit and shelter services. To address a pressure of this magnitude, while aiming to maintain and preserve services, we have taken a multi-year approach to the budget. The approach, which at its core is rooted in avoiding significant reductions to critical city services, looks to fully and sustainably address our operating challenges over the next 3 years. We factor $620 million in reductions in offsets, New Deal funding, and a 9% residential property tax increase in the 2024 budget, while also modeling expected offsets that can be achieved over the next 3 years through a combination of long-term financial plan actions, continued New Deal funding, anticipated multi-year property tax increases that we leverage for planning purposes, and finally, bridging strategies that, while applied in 2024 and to a lesser extent 2025, while our planned savings and offsets fully materialize by 2026. Also, for the 2024 budget, we had an opportunity to hear from the public prior to our budget launch today. We heard from our residents as part of our 16 budget consultation sessions and garnered over 10,800 responses to our online budget survey. Through these consultations, we heard from our residents that they would most support added investments in affordable housing and shelter services, transit services, and making Toronto safer. And while the budget primarily aims to maintain and preserve services, we have made critical new investments totaling $152 million in these areas most valued by our residents. To set context, today we're preparing an operating budget of $17 billion in gross expenditures. This includes $14.9 billion, or 88% of the overall budget, for our tax-supported programs, and $2.1 billion, or 12%, for our rate-supported programs, which include Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Toronto Parking Authority. This slide shows total gross and net budgets for 2024, with the full length of the bar depicting the total spend for 2024, and the yellow bars representing the amount of property tax funding dedicated to delivering these services. It also highlights in the lighter color the nearly $600 million in sustained COVID impacts within shelter and transit services, reflecting the added demand for our shelter services and reduced transit ridership revenue that is only expected to return to about 80% of our pre-pandemic experience by the end of 2024. As reflected in this table, we continue to spend significant amounts on the city's cost-shared social programs, with a total spend of $4.75 billion in 2024. This includes programs which receive contributions from other orders of government, such as Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, Shelter Support, Housing, and Toronto Community Housing, and also included our long-term care homes and public health. I won't speak to all the categories, but I'll quickly note nearly $2.6 billion in spending for transit services, which is the next major spending category. Next are our rate programs, reflecting 13% of total investments. Then the police and police board budgets with $1.35 billion in total spend and $1.2 billion in capital financing supports, with more than $900 million in debt servicing costs and nearly $300 million in capital from current funding that supports our capital program. I'll also point out corporate accounts with just over $1 billion includes expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, such as insurance and employee liabilities. This is also where we capture corporate revenues, such as dividends, land transfer tax, and is why the budget reflects an overall net revenue in this graphic. We've shown this slide over the last few years, and it captures the historic opening budget pressures the city has faced on an annual basis. What's important about this slide in 2024 is that while the nearly $1.8 billion pressure isn't as significant as the pressure we faced during the pandemic, the key difference is there is no longer any expected COVID support funding included in our budget. We are now at the stage post-pandemic where all the remaining sustained pandemic impacts, coupled with the very significant $1.2 billion in growth and inflationary impacts, will need to be fully addressed by our property tax base or other available city revenues. Given the magnitude of the opening pressure and to avoid otherwise necessary reductions to critical city services, we have introduced an enhanced multi-year strategy to successfully transition these pressures, including sustained COVID impacts, to be permanently funded within the city's budget. I'd like to delve into the 2024 opening budget pressure of almost $1.8 billion a bit more. As I noted, this does represent an increase from our initial estimate of $1.5 billion that was developed almost a year ago. This is no longer a forecast and is now supported by budget submissions provided by divisions and agencies as part of the 2024 budget process. And really, the increase from our previous estimate is related to two main drivers. First, it reflects an increased demand for shelter services, including for refugee claimants in our base system, And second, it reflects higher than initially forecasted transit costs arising from added investments made in the fall of 2023. Of the total pressure, 65% or $1.1 billion is attributed to transit and shelter services, which includes the $578 million in sustained impacts of the pandemic, as I previously discussed, as well as additional base transit pressures and system enhancements, including operations of Line 5 and 6 scheduled for 2024, service enhancements announced in the fall, and a series of other base transit pressures. This also includes costs associated with increased demands for our shelter services. The 2024 budget will allow for a total of 10,600 shelter beds. Toronto has more shelter beds and more beds per capita than any other Canadian city. That includes approximately 4,800 beds expected to be used by refugee claimants in 2024. The remaining 35% arises from inflationary and growth-related pressures from all other city divisions and agencies. The city continues to be challenged by greater demands for our services, as well as added inflationary increases and cost escalation to service delivery costs. So this is an updated version of a slide we used as part of the budget consultation process and aims to provide a visual representation of the budget challenge we face in 2024. The large red tower that you see on the left of the graphic represents to scale the 2024 opening budget pressure of nearly $1.8 billion. The much smaller green tower just to the right of it reflects the $42 million in annual revenue that is generated for every 1% residential property tax increase. So, and only to provide perspective, to fully offset the $1.8 billion pressure through property tax alone would require a 42% residential property tax increase. Now, the other towers that you see represent the portion of property tax funding that supports our municipal services that we provide here in the City of Toronto. This includes the portions above that bold red line that you might be able to make out there, reflected in TTC and shelter services, that represents permanent funding towards the sustained impacts of the pandemic. So alternatively, if we were to approach the 2024 budget challenge through program reductions alone, we could completely eliminate transit service in the city. That includes subways, streetcars, and buses, as well as completely eliminate all fire services and fire response in the city. And we would still be about $30 million short from balancing this year's budget. So I'd like to now take you through the approach that we've actually taken to bring forward a balanced 2024 budget. To do so, and with the lens of a multi-year approach that I had mentioned earlier, we've taken 5 key balancing actions. First, as we always do, as part of the annual budget process, staff review budget submissions and identify potential opportunities for offsets, efficiencies, and other revenue actions. This year, those actions total $620 million in offsets when factoring both $244 million in opportunities identified as part of budget submissions through all of our program staff and agencies, and a further $376 million in offsets identified post-budget submission leading up to today's budget launch. These actions include line-by-line program reviews to ensure budgets reflect prior year actual experience and expected 2024 experiences. User fee and revenue adjustments, $30 million in long-term financial plan actions, including new revenues from the graduated municipal land transfer tax rate on high-value homes, with additional financial benefits to be realized in future years. As I noted, a key goal of the 2024 budget was to preserve and maintain services and service levels. This budget does that with very limited amount of service reductions. One key reduction that is reflected in the 2024 budget is the elimination of the city's windrow clearing program that is currently provided through this winter in select areas of the city. We expect full-year savings of $16 million through the removal of this service that would be partially experienced in 2024 and fully realized by 2025. Our second series of actions include multi-year bridging strategies, which are designed to be temporary measures to strategically manage the pressure we face today and manage it over the next 3 years. This includes the full depletion of the remaining COVID backstop of $305 million and other one-time or limited time actions. Of these bridging, as these bridging strategies are reversed in 2025 and 2026, they will be replaced through other planned actions that will fully materialize over the next 3 years, predominantly those approved as part of the long-term financial plan. Third, our balancing actions factor $382 million in New Deal funding, mostly related to transit and shelter services. Fourth, the 2024 budget, staff prepared budget incorporates $380 million in additional revenue generated from a residential property tax rate increase of 9%. And lastly, we expect the availability of a federal funding program to offset costs for refugee claimant response. Next slide. So as I just noted, the city expects to have access to a federal funding program in 2024 to provide reimbursement of costs associated with refugee claimant response. The 2024 budget expects 4,300 shelter beds to be used for refugee claimants and asylum seekers at an initial cost estimate of $250 million. This represents additional costs beyond 500 dedicated spaces that are provided and funded by the city for refugee claimants in our annual base budget. I should note, $250 million is our current cost estimate. It is subject to change, and as we've seen over the last year, could easily fluctuate based on the actual demand for our shelter services. In short, the city expects access to a federal funding program in 2024 for reimbursement of refugee response costs. We are now in January of 2024, and in the absence of a federal funding commitment during this budget process, staff will report back to the special council meeting in February with actions required to maintain a balanced budget. I should note that the equivalent of an added 6% property tax increase would be required to support the 4,300 shelter beds for refugee claimants at an estimated cost of $250 million. On a more uplifting note, the 2024 budget incorporates funds expected from the New Deal agreement with the province and supports the city's multi-year strategy to achieve an enhanced level of financial sustainability by the end of 2026. The 2024 budget includes a total of $382 million in operating funding from the New Deal, including $75 million for operating costs associated with the provincially owned Eglinton Crosstown and Finch West LRT, or lines 5 and 6. $100 million to invest in subway and transit safety, recovery, and sustainable operations, $200 million for base shelter and homelessness supports, and to a lesser extent, $6.9 million in operating funding for the Gardner Expressway while the due diligence process is completed to upload it to the province. In 2025 and 2026, we expect a total of $410 and $445 million, respectively, in New Deal operating funding. In addition to the outcomes of the New Deal, this year's budget was heavily influenced by a series of new public consultation sessions held this past fall. Initiated by the mayor and our budget chair, the city hosted a month-long engagement campaign, including an online survey and various consultation sessions for residents to participate in. In total, the city received over 10,800 responses to our budget survey. We received over 11,600 ideas and comments in 28 different languages. We also got to meet with 661 participants at 16 different sessions, including in-person and virtual options across the city. An additional 314 participants joined in at local meetings hosted by community organizations with Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities. On a personal note, it really was a great experience being able to participate in these events and getting to meet with so many different people across the city and to travel to different neighborhoods and hear directly from residents about what they supported in the budget. Some of the key results from these consultations was that we received overwhelming support for increased investments in affordable housing and shelter services, with 37% of participants expressing support for investments in those areas. We also heard support for increased investments in transit and police services from 13% and 10% of participants respectively. Alternatively, we also heard from 43% of participants that the city should decrease investments in police services. 13% also felt we should decrease parking-related services. And lastly, 6% of participants felt we should decrease investments in both support for Toronto businesses and investments in arts and culture. Overall, though, the strongest message that was that there is agreement that other orders of government should pay their fair share of funding for intergovernmental responsibilities. 85% of participants agreed the provincial government should pay their fair share of funding, and 88% of participants agreed the federal government should. The 2024 budget includes additional spending of $152 million in new and enhanced initiatives in areas consistent with what we heard during public consultations. This includes almost $82 million in shelter and housing, including $31 million for the winter warming response plan, which adds 729 new shelter beds due to a surge in demand and change in threshold for extreme cold weather events from -15 degrees to -5. It also includes $35 million for 450 new dedicated shelter beds for refugee claimants, which contributes to the overall 10,600 shelter beds projected in 2024. Over $30 million in transit services and climate sustainability initiatives, includes $26 million to sustain the safety, security, and well-being program at the TTC, which ensures a safe, reliable service responsive to customer needs. And it also includes $1.2 million for the Environment and Climate Division to implement new emissions performance standards, a key action approved as part of the long-term financial plan. This team will develop standards for all existing buildings, which is the greatest source of GHG emissions in Toronto. We're spending almost $20 million on new community initiatives, including almost $17 million to increase direct nursing hours for residents at the city's long-term care homes, supported by provincial funding, and investing $2.5 million for the Toronto Public Library's Open Hours Implementation Plan, which will add additional hours throughout the week at a number of libraries, including expanding Sunday service to 8 additional branches. We're also investing $19 million in community safety initiatives, including almost $13 million to expand the Toronto Community Crisis Service to be a 24/7 citywide service representing the 4th emergency service in Toronto. And like last year, we continue to invest more in the council-approved staffing plans for paramedic and fire services. These staffing plans total an additional $5.5 million in 2024, which will allow for hiring of 52 new firefighters and 62 new paramedics this year. In addition to new initiatives, the 2024 budget makes considerable investments in existing services. I already mentioned this, but the 2024 budget initiates a permanent transition of $578 million in sustained pandemic impacts to the city's property tax base. This includes $304 million in transit and $274 million in shelter services, which is critical to both set a sound financial footing and preserve these services in the post-pandemic environment. The 2024 budget also supports additional base budget investments, including a few things I had previously mentioned, such as the full cost of enhanced transit services initiated in the fall, operating 2 new transit lines, line 5 and 6, scheduled to open this year, expands the city's shelter system to a total of 10,600 shelter beds, and makes additional city-funded investments in Toronto Community Housing Corporation, with total city funding in TCHC increasing to $346 million. Together, these new and base investments result in enhanced funding for shelter, housing, transit, and safety, all key areas we heard support for during the budget consultations. We've noted that this year's budget was developed with a multi-year lens, and we know that achieving financial sustainability for the city while preserving critical city services will require a multi-year approach. That is why we have taken an enhanced 3-year view to this year's budget. As we've seen, a lot can change in a year, but going into 2025, our current estimated operating pressure is approximately $1.4 billion. This includes the reversal of some of our bridging strategies, resulting in a $320 million pressure and a continued estimated cost of $250 million for ongoing refugee claimant response. We have a plan in place to address those pressures through a combination of balancing actions. This includes an incremental $146 million expected for further implementation of long-term financial plan actions, It also includes incremental new deal funding of $35 million for operations of lines 5 and 6. Consistent with our multi-year approach, we have assumed incremental property tax revenue of $280 million for budget planning purposes, as well as $250 million in annual federal funding to offset costs for the city's refugee claimant response. This is projected to require a remaining $719 million in reductions and offsets in 2025 through actions like our annual review process, efficiencies, and revenue actions. In 2026, we expect the opening pressure won't be as great, primarily due to a reduced need to reverse out 2024 bridging strategies. Like 2025, we expect incremental revenues from the New Deal, LTFP actions, property taxes, and federal funding to fully offset costs for refugee claimant response. Due to the phasing of key budget actions, we expect the remaining amount required to be identified through annual reductions and offsets will only be $335 million in 2026, which is far more manageable than our recent experience and sets the stage for enhanced financial stability within our operating budget. If you were one of the many people who tuned in during the public budget consultations, you might recognize this slide. Before we go any further in presentation, I'd like to reset the financial context. For all taxes and fees paid by the average resident in Canada, that includes your sales taxes, income taxes, and property taxes, municipalities only receive about 9%, which means 91 cents of every dollar in taxes you pay is actually going to the provincial and federal government. This is a key message during the long-term financial plan. The city currently does not have the revenue tools available that are commensurate with the scope and scale of services we deliver. So as I segue to the city's primary revenue source, property taxes, I'll reiterate that the 2024 budget incorporates a residential property tax rate increase of 9%. This equates to an annual increase of $321 for the average home, which has an assessed value of just under $700,000, or the equivalent of $26.75 monthly as an increase. The budget reflects an increase of 4.5% for multi-residential properties, half of the residential rate, 9% for industrial properties, and 4.5% for commercial properties. Since 2022, the city has maintained a small business property tax subclass, which provides a 15% rate reduction for eligible properties. The program currently benefits over 29,600 small businesses. The city also maintains property tax relief programs, including tax increase deferral programs and tax increase cancellation programs. In 2023, these programs benefited over 8,600 households, and since 2015 has provided $36 million in tax relief. Back in December, City Council approved interim rate increases of 3% for both Toronto Water and Solid Waste Management Services, which included water and wastewater consumption rates and solid waste rates and fees. The prepared budget before you today confirms those rates with no change to the 3% increase. This will result in an average annual household increase of $30 based on 230 cubic meters of water consumed, and it will result in an average increase of $9 to $16 for a single-family home, depending on the size of their garbage bin. So we're just going to take a little refresh break. Okay, now we're going to turn over to the capital budget and plan. The 10-year capital plan totals nearly $50 billion, with $4.6 billion in spending in 2024 alone. The capital plan is balanced while maximizing the use of non-debt financing strategies. We anticipate new intergovernmental funding as reflected in the New Deal. The capital plan leverages growth-related funding tools for eligible investments, and it maintains a debt service ratio under 15% for all years within our 10-year planning period. The capital budget includes a 1.5% increase for the City Building Fund levy, which will be leveraged to support critical investments in transit and housing. Like previous years, this year's budget continues to enhance our climate focus in the capital planning process. The 10-year plan includes climate mitigation and adaptation actions. The gross 10-year capital plan is just under $50 billion. This includes $32 billion, or 64% for our tax-supported programs, and $17.8 billion, or 36% for our rate-supported programs, including Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority. Of that amount, Toronto Water represents $16 billion in total spending over the 10-year period and actually reflects the single largest area of capital investment here in the city. So So, as noted, our largest area of capital funding is from water rate revenue, totaling $14.6 billion, which speaks to the success we have had in directing annual water rate increases to support investments in water infrastructure. Traditional tax-supported debt funding totals $6.6 billion, and while we're seeing increased debt servicing costs with higher interest rates, we do benefit from the use of green and social bonds while ensuring that our debt services costs remain under 15% in each year of the plan. In addition to traditional tax-supported debt, the City Building Fund contributes to $5.5 billion or 11% of total capital investments and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. Rounding out debt funding, we also have almost $2 billion funded through recoverable debt, which will be serviced through additional revenue sources generated through capital investments. These three debt-related sources total just over $14 billion or 28% of all funding in the 10-year capital plan. Moving down the list, development charge funding of $5.7 billion represents 11% of total capital funding dedicated to growth-related investments. The 10-year capital plan does reflect initial reductions in expected DC funding, primarily within affordable housing, while we await discussions with the province on keeping the city whole from the impacts of Bill 23. With the cancellation of the province's Bill 23 audit, discussions with the province around full reimbursement of Bill 23 impacts are ongoing. Reserve funds, excluding draws from water, development charges, and city building fund reserves, account for $3.8 billion in capital plan funding. The level of funding is consistent with commitments against city reserves where annual contributions are made, often through the operating budget, to support planned capital investments. An example includes fleet reserve contributions that support vehicle procurement plans in the capital budget. There's a further $3.6 billion in capital from current funding. As part of our operating bridging strategies, our capital plan does reflect a $57 million decrease in the level of CFC funding in 2024. This funding change was accommodated without any targeted capital project reductions through changes made to other available funding sources during the budget development process. The capital plan was developed with CFC funding returning to previously planned levels by 2026. And our capital plan continues to leverage funding partnerships with the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario, with total combined funding of $6.4 billion, reflecting 13% of total capital funding. The 10-year plan does include full provincial funding for the capital costs associated with the Gardiner of $1.9 billion, while the provincial due diligence process is underway. Once the Gardiner is uploaded to the province, the capital plan will be updated accordingly. The capital plan of nearly $50 billion will guide decisions on what investments will be made to purchase, build, and repair city infrastructure. Looking at key investments in this chart, you can see that over $16 billion or 29% of our capital plan is directed to water and wastewater infrastructure and stormwater investments, which is predominantly supported through water rate revenue and planned annual rate increases that has no reliance on the city's tax-based funding sources. This includes critical investments of $4.9 billion in water main and sewer replacement and rehabilitation, a further $4.6 billion for water and wastewater plants and facilities. The city's highest investment of tax-based funding is in transit at $13 billion. This represents 24% of the capital plan. This includes investments delivered by the TTC and to a lesser extent, transit expansion initiatives. This includes $3.2 billion for purchases of subways, buses, and streetcars, $3 billion in capacity improvements along Line 1 and 2, and almost $3 billion for TTC buildings and structures to ensure safe and reliable transit system. The city is also committed to spending $3.2 billion in housing, coupled with a further $5.3 billion in foregone revenues in the form of land contributions valued at $2.3 billion and city-directed incentives valued at $3 billion. We're making key investments in the city's housing TO plan. Specifically, the capital plan includes $567 million in funding to support delivery of 4,455 new rent-controlled units in support of the city's goal to have 65,000 new homes by 2030. We expect positive investments in housing to continue with new intergovernmental funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund and Building Faster Fund. In addition, we continue to advocate for funding from other orders of government to further increase Toronto's housing supply. We're also investing a further $5.7 billion in transportation and mobility through investments in road and bridge repair and safety, and cycling infrastructure. The city will also spend $4.3 billion in environment and recreation initiatives. This includes investments within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment and energy, as well as the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. PF&R's 10-year capital plan alone totals $3.6 billion, which includes almost $1 billion in SOGR funding for health and safety and aging infrastructure within existing parks and community recreation centers, and provides for more than $2.3 billion of capital investments enabling PF&R to advance various community recreation centers, as well as provides improvements for parks infrastructure like David Crombie Park revitalization, Toronto Island Park, Ravine strategy, and to address gaps and service growing communities. The city will also be investing almost $1.4 billion in fleet services, $1.3 billion in solid waste, $1.3 billion in corporate real estate, and just over $1 billion in emergency services. In total, the city expects over $3 billion in capital funding or relief over the next 10 years. This includes uploading the Gardner Expressway and Don Valley Parkway, currently budgeted at a value of $1.9 billion. Uploading the Gardner will eliminate the city's single largest SOGR liability, which will allow us to unlock $1.9 billion in funding for reinvestment in critical infrastructure and infrastructure renewal. These funds will be available for reinvestment commitments following the completion of the province's due diligence process. The province is also committed to providing $758 million in funding for the purchase of 55 new subway trains to replace those currently in use on Line 2. This reflects a critical capital investment to the TTC required to ensure the safety and reliability of the subway network. These funds are conditional on matching federal support and are not currently included in the TTC's 10-year capital plan, with the intent to add them to the plan upon federal funding confirmation. The new deal also confirmed $342 million in additional funding available through the Building Faster Fund based on Toronto's exceeding annual housing targets. As was endorsed in 2023, there is an incremental increase in the City Building Fund of 1.5% this year, which will result in an annual increase of $53 to the average home, or the equivalent of $4.42 each month. The City Building Fund levy is specifically dedicated to supporting transit and housing investments in the capital plan. With the continued growth of the city's capital plan, the City Building Fund remains critical in supporting priority investments. In 2024, the City Building Fund is expected to generate $315 million in revenue. To date, $967 million of investments have been made due to the City Building Fund. And as you heard me previously note, we'll support an additional $5.5 billion in capital investments over the next 10 years. This includes significant investments in transit, including the purchase of subway cars, buses, Line 1 and 2 capacity enhancements. This year, the capital plan continues to be developed with a climate focus. In developing the capital plan, staff identified opportunities to leverage our nearly $50 billion in planned capital investments over the next 10 years to support our goal of reducing GHG emissions and improving climate resilience, ensuring considerations of infrastructure investments involve a climate focus as part of the decision-making process. The 10-year capital plan makes investments in climate mitigation and adaptation actions aimed at reducing 75,000 tons of CO2 emissions while also improving resilience to climate change. In addition, several key actions outlined in the budget serve as a groundwork for future GHG reductions, which will be realized once projects and programs are fully implemented. The GHG reduction actions identified include a total planned capital investment, and again, that's for the entire project itself, of $12.9 billion and operating budgets of $63 million. Key highlights across our sector include investments that we're making within buildings, mobility and fleet, investments in areas that are supported by our rate programs, and as well other investments with actions to achieve greater resilience. Investments in state of good repair continue to be a capital priority. It reflects $26 billion or 52% of all planned capital spending over the next 10 years. This reflects an increase of $1.8 billion or 7% over what was identified in the 2023 plan. Significant investments are being made in critical areas, including continuation of strategic investments in water infrastructure. The city is investing a total of $1.6 billion towards SOGR for TCH building repair, which will provide ongoing capital funding to maintain existing TCH housing stock in a state of good repair. In addition, as part of the 2023 budget, there's added investments of $200 million to address critical SOGR works in parks, forestry, and recreation in order to mitigate service disruptions and prevent unplanned facility closure. Critical priority SOGR projects include the St. Lawrence Community Center, Scarborough Gardens, Arena roof replacement, George Bell Arena. Even with added investments, the city's SOGR backlog is expected to grow from $10.6 billion at the end of 2023 to $22.7 billion by 2033. This has been driven by significant cost escalation, in part due to high inflation and recent supply chain issues, updated assessment of our infrastructure and assets, and infrastructure nearing the end of its useful life. The city is committed to continuing to address our growing backlog, and that's reflected in the added investment that you see here in the plan. The challenge is, even with that added investment, our SOGR is growing at a faster rate than we had even estimated last year. We do look to continue to address this moving forward. Following the province's due diligence process, Gardner and DVP funding will be reallocated in support of infrastructure renewal. As mentioned in the LTFP, staff will develop an enhanced capital prioritization framework, which will further prioritize capital investments. We'll continue to enhance our capital asset management planning with a report on non-core assets to come later this year. And lastly, the City Building Fund will continue to be used to mitigate transit and housing SOGR pressures. Okay, in conclusion. For decades, the City of Toronto was on a challenged financial path. We couldn't keep pace with the growing number of capital and operational pressures. As the economic engine of Ontario and Canada, the path we were on and the challenge we faced were truly unique to Toronto. Torontonians have stepped up to do all they could, but it's clear that we could not change direction alone or overnight. We are now on a new path that will enhance our future financial stability. We are embarking on a multi-year approach to address the city's financial challenges, which will incorporate both city-led initiatives and achieve budget reductions and offsets, and will apply New Deal supports from the provincial government. Over the next 3 years, we'll continue to set the course for Toronto's future. This year's operating budget of $17 billion maintains core services and service levels while making key investments in transit, shelter, and community safety. A key component of this year's budget is the permanent transition of the sustained pandemic impacts to the city's tax base. We do expect federal funding programs for refugee claimant response and require the federal government to provide a firm funding commitment shortly. The 10-year capital plan of almost $50 billion continues to prioritize investments in SOGR while making advancements in transit and housing, with a focus on affordability and the capacity to deliver. The plan is achievable while staying within the city's debt service ratio of 15%. We're also proud of our climate focus we continue to advance during the capital planning process. So before I fully wrap up, I'll take a moment just to go through the updated schedule with everyone. Next week, from January 16th to 18th, you'll receive presentations from our service areas and key agencies. On those same dates in the evenings, this year, the city will be hosting new telephone town halls, providing more opportunities for residents to participate in the budget process. This is the first time we've hosted these, and it will be great to have another opportunity to connect with the community. On February 22nd and 23rd, there will be another opportunity for the public to participate through public deputations, the Budget Committee. On January 26th, we have a wrap-up Budget Committee meeting to review any further budget materials and questions. Then there will be a special council meeting on February 14th to focus the budget, to discuss the budget following the mayor's release of her proposed budget on February 1st.
So I have some non-member guests here I'm very happy to say. So we're going to start a list and we're going to go with councillors that are outside the Budget Committee first, including we have some virtual participants. Okay, so just so we have the order, we'll start virtually. So Councillor Crisanti has a question, then Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Nunziata, then Councillor Sachs, Councillor Peruzza, and last but not least, our newest councillor, newest addition to council. Okay, so Councillor Crisanti, would you like to take it away? You have 5 minutes. If this is a huge presentation, so we have to go into a second round, we will, but we will keep time. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Councillor Crisanti.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And so first of all, I'd like to thank staff and Steve for the presentation. There's a lot there, no doubt. Steve, I just want to go back to probably one of the final comments you were making with respect to the core services. That now it's a $17 billion operating budget, and you indicated, I think, somewhere along your presentation that part of the services that will be removed is windrow cleaning during the winter. Did I hear that correctly?
Through the budget chair, yeah, as we've noted in the presentation, as part of the over $600 million in reductions and offsets that we've identified, we have looked to limit impacts on service changes. However, one area where we have introduced the service change is in the removal of the windrow clearing service. The expectation is that we would continue to provide the service over the current winter, but we would look to see that removal beginning in the 2024-2025 winter season, with a total annualized savings of $16 million factored into our multi-year approach.
All right. Well, thank you. So that, of course, will be a great concern for many, many residents who really depend on having full access to their end of their driveway after a major snowstorm. So, all right, so I just wanted to get that clarified. Are there any other services that I missed? Because you were very clear in your point that we are maintaining core services, but we just heard that windrow cleaning will not be part of that, at least in the coming year.
Yeah, through the chair, and I specifically noted that because that is really the one key service change that you will see. Again, through this year's process, the aim was to bring forward a strategy and approach that looked to maintain and protect the critical city services that we provide here in the city, with that exception that I just noted.
All right. So to the building fund, how much is currently in that account? How much do we have in the building fund? What's that look like?
Well, the city building fund itself, so we do have a reserve, but the reserve itself is built in a way to be able to support planned capital spend. So the intent of the reserve is through the annual levy, which this year is expected to generate over $300 million. Those contributions go into the reserve. They then service the debt, both the debt that we've already issued for the nearly $1 billion of investments that we've made to date, funded through the City Building Fund, or the $5.5 billion of investments that we are planning over the next 10 years. So the intent is that reserve will gradually build, but then be depleted over 30 years as it services that debt. I can call up the exact balance, but it's a little challenging in that there are commitments against any balance that we have based on the $1 billion in capital financing it's already supporting.
Well, Steve, it's important to know what that balance is, because look, we're entering a year where there's, you're proposing through your budget a total of 10.5% tax increase, and then maybe if the federal government doesn't come through, there's going to be an additional 6%. I think this is the time to maybe realistically look at the possibility of just eliminating the 1.5%, at least this one time, to mitigate the impact on the increase. Your thoughts on that, Steve?
Through the chair, through the budget committee process, recommendations can be made as it relates to the city building fund. As it relates to the city building funding, any change in the levy, because the levy is incorporated in the 10-year capital plan, would need to come with an offset in planned capital spending. So the 1.5% increase is expected to generate about $630 million. So if we look at that and the impacts it has over the full 10-year, eliminating that increase this year would have a compound effects over a 10-year period. Just on a straight line would be $630 million. You then have to compound it, so we're probably talking $680 million or so that we would need a corresponding reduction in our capital plan to support any changes to the endorsed plan and increases to the city building fund.
Okay, and is that possible?
Through the budget chair, with the identification of capital projects to reduce, that could be a consideration.
All right.
Last question,
So,
Councillor
Madam Chair,
Crisanti.
my time's almost up.
Yes.
I may have another round later. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll check back in then. Thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Yeah, I have quite a few questions, so I'm just going to rapid fire them. Just to be clear, the residential tax increase is 9% proposed, correct? Yes?
For the operating, yes.
And then the city building fund, which is a separate line item, is 1.5.
Through the chair, correct?
And when was the city building fund established? What year? 2013 or 14?
Well, so I believe the city building fund itself, I think, was 2016. It followed the Scarborough subway levy that was
Correct.
established around 2013.
So the city building fund was morphed from the Scarborough subway levy, which was established by Mayor Ford in order to build the Scarborough subway, and we just built on that. So it's just a steady piece that moves through every budget until 2023. Do I have that right, what I read here?
So the city building levy, our capital plan has been built and predicated on what was endorsed by council last year that would see the city building levy increase by 1.5% every year until 2035.
Right, so, but that wasn't established right now. This has been established previously.
This is
Just working off a council direction, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Could you tell me the actual COVID shortfall, the amount that's the COVID shortfall? I don't, maybe it's in there and I haven't seen it. I'd like to understand that. I'd also like to understand the impact in dollars of the provincial planning changes that were put on the city, those two numbers, if you have them.
Sure. So with regards to the sustained impacts of the pandemic, those reside within transit and shelter services. That number is $578 million. That was one of the key challenges that we faced in the development of this budget, where unlike prior years during the pandemic, we've now shifted that over to the property tax base.
That's fine. So we're just looking at what our shortfall, what we're carrying from the pandemics, $578 million that basically we have invoices out there that haven't been paid, right? And then the impact of the provincial policy changes, legislative changes on revenues to the city, particularly around DCs and everything else. Do you have that number?
Yes. So with regards to Bill 23, the impact on capital funding available and predominantly through reductions in development charge revenue, we've estimated the impact based on our previous growth projections to be $2.3 billion. Obviously, that increases if you see a higher level of development over the next 10 years.
Is that over what period?
10 years.
So 10 years, so $2 billion a year in loss. That's what we're looking at.
230 million a year.
230 million. 230 million. Okay, thank you, a year. And then on page number 14, you have a list of the breakouts. Is it possible to break out some, like affordable housing and shelters? I think they're personally, you have it in a basket, but there's two separate numbers there. I think the public parks and recreation, they see those separately. We see them together. Parks, what's that? Recreation, what's that? Forestry, what's that? And again, for breaking out the roads, lanes, and sidewalks. I think it's helpful for me and my residents to have those numbers clearer.
And through the budget chair, so next week the programs will be coming back. This was a grouping of all of our program areas. They will have all that detail broken out by the services that they
By
do.
high level, again, we'll see that. And what's the
Yeah,
cost
and
of the?
that breakout will also be online today.
Well, thank you. We'll see if that works. And the Gardner deal, the exact amount of money that I know the Gardner inside, outside, upside, downside. So the hybrid, the cost of the hybrid is being assumed. What are the total costs that are going to come back to us from the Gardner and when?
So the total is roughly $1.9 billion. That also includes a small component for the DVP as well, but a much smaller.
Of the what? Sorry.
Of the Don Valley Parkway as well, but a much smaller amount.
Flyover or the whole Don Valley?
No, sorry, the entire, the steady repair
So
work
we'll
for the
break
entire
that
Don
out,
Valley,
okay.
which I think off memory was about 40 million or so.
Right.
In terms of our ability to release those funds, we are awaiting the completion of the province's due diligence process to be able to confirm the full release. As of now, our capital plan was built with the provincial funding included. Longer term, what you will see is our capital plan will completely eliminate the costs associated with that. And the provincial funding that we've added is that will now come off the city's books.
And for the smart track stations that we are on the hook for, the cost? Is that in there?
So we will, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me of all the different program budgets. Again, we'll be coming back next week, and
Will you
each of
have
the
that
program
number
areas will be
publicly?
here and be able to speak to their respective budgets.
Will that be a public number?
Yes, it's included in our 2024
Is it
budget.
in transit, or which bucket is that going to be
It
in?
might be in the Transit Expansion Initiative in terms of the capital funding associated with that work.
All right, thank you very much. And the FIFA shortfall, is that in the 10-year operating where?
Yeah, Councillor Fletcher, you're over
I'm
time,
over, okay.
but I'm gonna go back and ask if we need a second round, so I'll get back
Okay,
to you, but
so I'll
that's,
just park
you're
that.
well over the 5 now.
Thank you. Well, not well over, just 15 seconds.
Well, it's kind of a relative term, isn't it? And I want to remind people, you will, that some of the breakout detail is going to be available. The analyst notes are going to be available soon. But the presentation is at a higher level, and it's the presentation we're asking questions on now. Councillor Nunziata, I have Councillor Nunziata next.
I believe that Councillor Ainsley is on the screen now, if you wanted to.
Yes,
get in.
Councillor Ainsley, when I was canvassing for questions earlier, I think you were muted. Did you want to be on the list to question?
Oh, I'm fine, Chair Carroll. I had techie issues with my mute button, but I'm fine now. But at this point, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Well, you look great.
Councillor
You've obviously
Nunziata.
got good lighting. Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you, Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions. So, and Councillor Crisanti asked one of the questions, but as far as the reduction in services, like the windrows, and are we going to get a list, an itemized list on all the services that we're reducing? So we can relate that to our constituents? Because it's hidden now, and I think I need to know.
Yeah, through the chair. So what we're presenting today is the overview of the entire
Right.
budget. What will be available later today is
Okay.
going to be each of the detailed budget notes for all of the services and agencies across the city. Within those budget notes, we'll speak to all of the investments in our base systems, enhancements, as well as any reductions that may be proposed. At the same time, I also believe staff are in the process of developing a briefing note that had been requested to us as part of the long-term financial plan that will break out and identify all of the balancing measures that we've taken as part of this budget that will detail all of the changes that are included.
Okay, so we'll be getting that list then. Sure, okay. My second question is, so this budget is based on the federal government not stepping up, correct?
So the information through the chair that you have indicates what we need. To date, we're not able to confirm that we have access to those resources. So we're not assuming anything, but we needed to produce the reality of the situation, which is we do not have confirmation of a funding source.
So the budget then is based on not receiving those funds as of yet, correct?
I think through the chair, the way I describe it, this presentation does not include those
Right.
as of yet.
Okay, good. So if they do step up and we get the funding, what would the budget be?
So through the chair, it makes no change to the other numbers that you see. So if the federal government does not come through, we would have to find strategies to increase the available funding to cover off those expenses. It would not, if the federal government or when they announce our access to funding, it would not reduce the operating tax increase.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Councillor Sachs next.
Thank you, and thank you very much to staff. I know there's an enormous amount of work that goes into preparing this, and perhaps some of the answers I'm looking for will be in the materials we don't have yet. But first of all, I want to confirm that with this budget and with the increases that you're talking about, we are still predicting, other than the water service, a steady and substantial decline in the state of good repair of the city. Correct?
Yeah, through you, Budget Chair. Yes, that's correct. Even with a $1.8 billion in added SOGR investment, we've seen an increase in our overall projected backlog.
Right, so this is a budget for continued decline of the city, worse streets, worse parks, less reliable city services at every part of the city, basically except the water service. Is that right? On the whole?
So there is information in the appendix where you will see by service area in the city where the expectation is the backlog is going to grow. And to your point, Toronto Water would be the most significant where you see an improvement. Outside of that, the majority, you do see a continued increase in the backlogs.
Right. And when we have a, state of good repair backlog, people don't understand, means we're not doing the preventative maintenance and the daily required maintenance that our engineers tell us we need to do in order to reduce long-term costs, improve reliability, and maintain the livability of the city, right? Is that right?
So through the chair, yes, but the caveat I'll say is never at the cost of health and safety related pieces. So what it does is extend the lifespan beyond what is the useful life. It really increases our costs of maintaining a safe environment and facility for that. So yes, decline is one piece of that, but never at the expense of health and safety.
Right, but it does mean that, for example, the buses and streetcars are less reliable, the roof of the arena is more likely to fail, and the total cost for the city continues to go up and up.
So through the chair, you've hit on it dramatically, which is it just is more expensive to continue to do the sticky tape and elastic band routine in terms of maintenance as opposed to the full replacement and the upgrading that is. It also does not allow us, in the case of transit infrastructure, does not allow us to access better ways for efficiency and effectiveness of those tools because of the old stock just won't allow us to use some of the new technology.
Right, and what you told us last year was that continuing to defer maintenance, allowing this decline, means an exponential increase in total costs for the city and the people in it, right?
Through the chair, yes.
Okay. If the province had permitted us to bring in a 1% sales tax, as we voted for last spring, how much would you have been able to change this budget?
Assuming the full implementation of a sales tax in 2024, and we did note it would obviously take some time to implement, the expectation is it could generate around $800 million in additional revenue annually.
So we wouldn't need the property tax increase that you've proposed here, and we would be able to start repairing the city.
Through the chair, that'd be accurate.
Okay, but the province isn't letting us do that. All right, you don't have to answer that. So we also had a lengthy discussion in terms of long-term financial planning about additional revenue tools, particularly a parking levy and a stormwater area charge. And why are there no new revenue sources addressed in this budget?
Through the chair, so there are. So what's included in this budget and also what's included in our multi-year strategy is we're looking at the time it will take to both implement and for those revenues to fully materialize. So as we've embarked on a 3-year strategy and the way we've built the budget is we are factoring in the revenues we're able to collect in 2024, and it's about $30 million through actions that have already been approved by council. We have the new graduated land transfer tax for higher value properties. We have some procurement savings, some other initiatives in parking. We then also build out and forecast the additional revenues that we're expecting to generate over 2025 and 2026 through the implementation of those strategies that staff are bringing forward and continuing to bring forward implementations on. So the budget is built on the expectation over 3 years that we will generate that incremental revenue.
So this budget does plan that we'll adopt the parking levy in time for it to be paying next year.
So as part of our outlook is an assumption that there is additional revenue coming from LTFP actions, including the consideration of a commercial parking levy.
Okay. On page 20, you talk about a little extra money for the for the crisis service, but it's not enough money from what they told us to actually, on page 20, you've said for community safety, there's a total of $19 million over the entire city, some of that for the community crisis service, some for paramedic and fire. But didn't you tell us, I don't know, 2 months ago that we would need more than $100 million to roll out the community crisis service over the city as a whole?
Through the chair to the councillor, I'm not sure about that reference. This is the money that is required to roll out the crisis service citywide in 2024 that social development and finance has asked for.
Excellent. That's good news.
Councillor Sachs, sorry, you're well over time. Even I lost track there. But I'll be asking for a second round if time allows.
Thank you.
Councillor Perruzza, I have you next.
Thank you. Councillor Sachs dealt with sort of one side of the side of the equation that I wanted to deal with in terms of the notion that even if we do all of this stuff, the city continues to decline. I just want to focus in on the other side of the equation, the sort of the property tax side of it. So the way I read this is, so in 2025, you're projecting a further property tax increase of about 7%, correct?
So we have some initial estimates for planning purposes in 2025 and 2026. Again, I think I need to stress these are for planning purposes
Correct.
only.
No, I understand.
I believe the numbers would be closer to 6.5 and then 5.
6.5 and then 5.
But again, that would be subject to other actions.
But that wouldn't include the city building component. That would be on top of that, right?
So again, this speaks strictly to the supports we would need on the operating budget, aside from the city building.
So, right. So that's for those two. And in terms of your land transfer tax, I'm not really understanding that here. How is that? How are you projecting that going forward this year and 25 and 26? What do you think is going to happen there?
So we've actually taken a reduction to the land transfer tax in 2024. And again, that's based on some of the experience that we've seen over this year where we've really benefited.
How much?
I can pull the exact number. Maybe I can ask our team of financial planning to give you the exact number.
Chair, the MLTT revenue for 2024 is expected to be gross revenue $900 million. So it is about $48 million less than 2023 budget to budget.
48 million less than 2023. And then in 25?
So again, when we're going to model it based on our 2023 experience, and we're projecting that, we've taken a different approach to MLTT. What we've done over the last couple of years is we've tried to safeguard the city from the volatility that you see annually. And while we had traditionally last year a $950 million budget for land transfer tax, only $725 million was actually directed to the operating budget. So again, what we've done is we built essentially a buffer in the budget, and the additional funds above that contributed directly to our capital program or to capital reserves. That gave us the ability to manage any decrease in revenue, especially what we saw this year, in a way that over a longer period of time, you could expect a rebound, and it's a lot easier to manage those challenges in the capital plan. So as a result of that.
That's great, because that'll take out some of the peaks and valleys that would cause going forward. So that's good that you've thought about that. Inflation. So what do you see this year and then next year and the following year? Like, what do you?
So we track.
What does that look like?
We track inflation for the Toronto census area on a monthly basis, consistent with what we've done every year. We will look at the trailing average.
No, but with the numbers. So what number did you plug in this year? What number did you plug in?
4.2% is the number that we saw based on the trailing average was 4.2%.
In 25?
We have some. I'm going to turn to Anthony to give the projections for next year.
Through the chair, the projection for the CPI in 2025 is 3.5%.
3.5 and 26?
I'm just looking at that, my staff, just a second.
So it'd probably roughly around
the same range in the order of 3%.
What have you done for interest rates?
In terms of interest rate, what we see the experience at the end of 2023 is at 5%.
Yeah. So you know what? You're right. There isn't enough time here for me to fully understand what that means, but I will. And so let me ask you this last question. So so in this term of office, I'm adding this up, and you're going to ask us to increase property taxes by over 30%, right? 7.5 last year, 10.5 this year, 7, 6, and roughly it'll represent a property tax increase of, I don't know, 31, 32, 33%, the way you're basically outlining. And the city is going to continue to decline. Like, wouldn't you agree that this isn't working and we need another plan, right?
We've been saying it for some time.
I think through the chair, the long-term financial plan, laid that out. There have been initial steps in terms of additional resources for key services from the provincial government. We hope the federal government will follow suit. We need different revenue tools. The reality is you can't absorb the impact of the COVID-related costs and all of the other things that are going on in Toronto strictly on a property tax base. We say that over and over again, yet there is slow incremental movement.
So why do you keep recommending increasing
Councillor,
property?
that was your last question,
It's not
so I'm
working. Why do
just
you keep
letting
doing it?
staff complete their answer. 'cause
So
you're
through
out
the
of time.
chair, at the end of the day, we
Last
have
question.
limited tools. So there are two choices for us. We can present to you, and it's for your consideration ultimately. Council will determine the tax rate at the end of the day. We put forward for you all the ways that we can mitigate. We have worked very hard with you in terms of intergovernmental work. We continue to talk about the need for a fundamental change in revenue tools. But the bottom line is we have then what's left over, we have two choices, property taxes and some fees, or we can look at reducing services. We've chosen this year not to from a citywide service perspective. And Windrose is not a citywide service, but from a citywide service perspective, not to reduce those in any meaningful way. And therefore, we're left with a property tax increase to cover some of the difference.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Thank you, Councillor Peruzza. Okay, tense up. First, budget questions from our new councillor. Councillor Candoval, you're next.
Thank you, Chair Carroll. Thank you to staff for this comprehensive overview of the challenges before us. I know it had certainly taken a lot of work over the last while. During my last 2 years at the school board as the chair of budget, so I have an intimate sense of how hard staff work. So my kudos and thanks for the countless hours and long nights into this work. And I'd like to start my first question around some of the values that help frame this draft proposal along the voices we heard during the community consultations and prioritizing the most vulnerable and the important services that's accessible to those who are vulnerable. And my concern, to build on previous councillors, we have public statements for our senior strategy. We're seeing considerable demographic change. I think in our senior strategy, it says that we're headed towards more folks who are 65 and above compared to those 15 and below. And we've made a commitment in that strategy that how do we make city services for seniors easy to use and navigate and to improve their quality of life. And it's in that I asked through you, Madam Chair, how do we reconcile cutting or at least proposing to cut the Windrose service in light that so many seniors, especially with these changing increased demographics, sustain that in light of our commitments to those who are most vulnerable and our commitments to aging in place.
So through the chair, it's never easy when you put forward changes to service. The principle we did use was about citywide services. So, and as I've mentioned, the Windrow Clearing is not a citywide service. Obviously this is put forward as a possibility. We're looking at ways to reduce costs. We're looking at ways to bring in new revenue. We're looking at ways to best utilize a property tax increase to maintain the best basket of services possible. and you'll ultimately have to decide whether that mix is accurate or not. I will say that more broadly, we have prioritized ways that we can help older adults, and transit is an example of that. We really need to think about a way that we can move people as they age, and potentially for those who have been driving for many years no longer have access to that vehicle. We have created through changes at Toronto Community Housing, a seniors housing corporation, which is going to prioritize the 15,000 seniors who live in seniors-only buildings at the Seniors Housing Corporation and their needs. And we'll continue to do that work. So yes, on that particular service, Councillor, that's a decision that we've placed for consideration within this budget. It wasn't taken lightly, but our goal was to protect citywide services as best as we could.
I appreciate that reflection and looking at matching our values to our investments. I have a second question to give us a quick example of when we look at the $250 million needed for asylum and refugee seekers. Where's the bulk of that expenditure going? Is it into new shelters, the building of new shelters, or is it a transaction with other providers?
So through the chair, it's a transaction of the use of those shelter spaces, some of which are increased shelter spaces. So we've taken on additional leases or looked at opening new space. But this is the day-to-day costs that are associated with providing that shelter, primarily within an existing system, although there has been some targeted expansion to deal with the higher numbers.
Thank you for that. Can staff provide a sense of where discussions are with the province on development charges and the potential revisions to Bill 23? Is there anything significant, or is it difficult to share right now?
Well, through the chair, we had been working with the province as part of the Bill 23 audit itself. As you may know, that audit was terminated late in 2023. We've had some initial discussions with staff and our counterparts at the provincial government, and we're expecting new discussions now to begin between the city and the province directly as it relates to the impacts of Bill 23 and options available to continue with the commitment to keep the city whole.
Very quickly, last question. I'm trying to understand, I wasn't obviously here when the city building levy was in place. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 1.5 that's added to it. So what was the base and what are we at now when we look at the evolution of it?
Sure, and I can dig up the exact numbers, but it was originally introduced, and I believe the year was 2016. Originally came in, it had no baseline, it didn't exist before then. The equivalent of a 0.5% property tax increase was originally introduced. And the intent was to then leverage those funds and to have that increase continue for 5 years, to leverage those funds for critical transit and housing investments. Through time, and as we understood more from the TTC's capital investment plan and our housing needs, it became evident that that wasn't going to be adequate to address the needs. Through work that happened initially, probably 3 or 4 years ago, the decision was to extend it from a 0.5 to a 1.5. And then discussions happened as part of last year's budget process to receive council endorsement to take that 1.5 annual increase and to build that all the way out to 2035. In terms of where we would sit today, we can probably do some quick math. I'm looking at Lauren, who's probably doing it as we speak. I think it might be around a total cumulative around 10, but I'll get you the exact number since its inception.
Thank you.
Okay. There you go. Thank you. I'm going to go now, councillors, to members, and then we'll check time after that and see if we can do a second round. But we've got lots of opportunity next week. So I'm going to start with Councillor Moyes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I too want to convey my thanks to Mr. Comforti and his team. I know this is a lot of hard work. I went to a few of the pre-budget consultations and I was able to hear directly from the public. And I've heard that people want better transit, more libraries, of course. They want a clean city. They want a safe city as well. But we also know that we've started with a $1.8 billion shortfall as well. And you've mentioned in your presentation that there have been a few enhancements presented here. So can you perhaps dig into or even let us know what these enhancements are and why were they prioritized?
Sure, through you, Budget Chair. So we had noted that there was over 150 million in enhancements that had been identified in the budget. They're a reflection of a few things. They're a reflection of some of the commitments that have been made in the past, and that's true for the hiring plans for the paramedics and fire services. Also true as it relates to some of the commitments that we had seen on crisis response initiatives, but they're also consistent with the feedback that we did hear from the public. And I'm just checking what slide it is. Slide 20. Yeah, slide 20 gives a quick snapshot of some of those enhancements. So again, in shelter services, our winter warming response plan. There was a change from council where our winter warming response would begin at -5 degrees rather than the -15 that had been established in the past. There were additional service and service restoration within our transit services that were announced last fall. Direct care for long-term care homes, library open hours implementation. I'd mentioned crisis response and paramedic and fire services, emissions performance standards. So again, as we were looking through the opportunities, we were reviewing those against some of the commitments the council had previously made, but also what we had heard through the public as part of the budget consultation process and the alignment that we saw with the feedback that we were receiving.
Okay, thank you. And so we also know that the reason why we are in this situation is partially because of COVID, but also to underinvestments over the years. I know when Rob Ford was here, we had almost zero property tax increases, for example. And I believe that, this has become a perfect storm as to where we are today. But what does a significant investment in city services this year do for future years? And how does this set up to be able to deliver more enhancements for people in the future budget years?
Through the budget chairs, as we reflected in the presentation, one of the key goals of this year's budget plan was to look at it through a multi-year lens and looking at it through a lens where we could achieve an enhanced fiscal stability. And really with the work that we did as part of the long-term financial plan, with the initiatives endorsed by council, coupled with the actions that are presented in this budget, and the New Deal funding that we've received commitment from the province, it does really put us on an enhanced footing to be achieved by 2026. The benefit of that is it gives us greater opportunity to leverage abilities for efficiencies and offsets and other actions that we might take, including property taxes, to look at critical areas in the city where we can make enhancements rather than addressing a budget challenge in the magnitude of $1.8 billion that we've been faced with this year.
So do you expect that in year 2025, 2026, there might also be a slight property tax increase as well?
So we do expect that there would continue to be property tax increases in both 2025 and 2026. And again, that's part of the longer term strategy that would take us to that financial stability. One of the key differences, and especially with the work we're doing this year in looking at transitioning those sustained COVID impacts to the property tax base, is it really ensures that unlike the experience that we've had this year, where the aim and the goal was really around preserving and maintaining services, it opens up a lot more flexibility in terms of our budget planning, whereby we wouldn't be as reliant on reduction options and offsets simply to maintain and protect the services that we deliver.
And since I have a few seconds left, and I think Councillor Sachs mentioned this as well, but in regards to the 1% sales tax, are there still conversations with the province around that? And I know that you had some council direction to actually pursue that, but one of the things I've heard from community is that perhaps we should look at a GTHA property tax increase. Because one of the concerns I've heard was that, people may just cross the border to Mississauga or Brampton and shop there because they'd save the 1%.
So through the chair, the growth-related taxes, and sales tax is one, but income tax is another, is an area that we need to continue to explore. In terms of the New Deal discussions in the fall, much because of the time frame we were under, it was not a part of the discussions at all. We continue to have, as part of that deal, a commitment to each other to look at what the longer-term sustainability plan looks like, and we continue to advocate that growth-related revenue streams are what cities need. We are further supported in that endeavor by a number of other organizations that take into account other municipalities. So the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, all are also working on how we advocate collectively. Because I think you're right, while Toronto could have some specific pieces which may work in Toronto, you wouldn't want to set up a situation where there is simply a jurisdictional jumping at the border of Mississauga, at the border of Durham or York region, that we simply jump over the border in order to avoid this or that. So I do believe that the growth-related pieces are more of a broad municipal ask that we should have. I think Toronto has continued to take a leadership role in those discussions, but we need to work with our municipal partners to see that come to fruition. But make no mistake, we never left it. What was clear is that in the terms of the New Deal in the fall, those were not discussions that we were going to have in the context of that very short window of discussion.
Okay, Councillor McKelvey is next.
Thank you. What is the balancing strategy if the federal government doesn't step up with the $250 million for refugees?
So through the chair, we would have to look at a combination of things. One of the pieces we have put out there is that it's equivalent to a 6% property tax increase. That's the general, it's at 42 million, a percentage point. That's what it would be. That's not to say that is the staff recommendation as to what we would need to do. There's a number of things. For one is, I think we would need to review what our service level of commitment is going to be around this. As Steve pointed out, the other side is this is based on today's numbers. Where are the numbers going? The second piece is we could look at other strategies within our portfolio of what we have to how we could mitigate some of those costs, either in the short term or the long term. But we have very few options is the short answer. And we would need to bring back what that suite of it is. I don't know how you would avoid additional property taxes to cover $250 million.
Just to be crystal clear, the 10.5 you're proposing does not include the $250 million for the refugee funding.
Through the chair, correct.
Okay. On slide 20, when you talk about the enhanced services, you mentioned 450 new dedicated shelter beds. Is that included in the 10,700 that we already have? Like this isn't, is that included in the 250 million?
That is part of the 10,600 beds that we're estimating for 2024.
That we're estimating for 2024. Okay. Also on there, there's a line item about open hours implementation plan for Toronto Public Library. How much is that?
Through the chair, the Toronto Public Library open hour is going to be for phase 1 implementation in 2024, $2.5 million.
Okay. Windrow Services, I echo the comments of our new councillor, Kendeville here. You mentioned that this is not a citywide service, but we have many services in the city that aren't citywide. Is that a principle that all services must be citywide and equitable across the entire city?
No, through the chair, that's not what that comment was. I think what you see in some of the slides was our commitment was to maintain services and service levels. That commitment was really about making sure those citywide services are maintained. So no, we do have other examples of services that are geographically based, nor are all services equally distributed across the city, even in some of those citywide services. So
when
no.
Sidewalks were not equitably plowed across the city, we didn't say all sidewalks should not be plowed, correct? Like we actually added service as opposed to take away service from people that have their sidewalks plowed.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay. And windrows are $16 million?
Through the chair for a full year, yes.
And it will be very crystal clear to us next week, any additional service cuts or impacts that are in this budget?
Yes, through the chair, the divisional budgets will indicate those service levels.
The transition to multi-year budgets, when will we expect that? And would that include certainty around expected property increases year over year?
So through this budget process, what we've done is we've built the multi-year approach based on estimated property tax revenues really for planning purposes. What we'll bring forward to council is we'll seek endorsement and approval for the 2024 rate increase. It's not much different than what we do with the City Building Fund or what we do with the Toronto Water and Solid Waste rates, where you build and model based on expected increases over the next, in their case is 10 years. In this case, we would apply it over 3 years. So it's really around taking a consistent approach rather than setting pre-existing approvals, which are challenging from a governance perspective.
Okay, you mentioned that we still have to continue work through the new deal for the Gardner. What will be the approvals process for the redistribution of that fund? So how will council weigh in on that?
So again, it would depend on the timing. My initial expectation is we would likely have an opportunity to do that through the budget process. But again, it would be subject to the timing and completion of the due diligence process itself.
Okay, and have we done a jurisdictional scan of other property tax increases? So I will point out Vancouver was 10% last year, getting that out there. What have we seen in other municipalities? Like, we are not unique in the structural deficits that we face.
I can start. I do know we've contacted our colleagues in other municipalities. We have some initial estimates that have been provided them, but nothing public. We are seeing across the board municipalities are continuing to face the same challenges we're facing. They're facing it as it relates to the structural deficit resulting from the limited taxation powers that municipalities have, but also many municipalities are dealing with the same challenges we're facing as it relates to refugee response actions. And while I don't have their exact numbers and can't confirm where ultimately their councils will land, we are hearing uniformly across the board that there are significant challenges and pressures in neighboring municipalities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor. I have Councillor Chang next.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you so much. I know you've probably sacrificed your holidays even to spend a lot of time to put this together. It's a very complex. I often say that the City of Toronto's budget and population is the size of a province. So you're actually functioning as ministers, even though you don't know it. So my question to you is, we've heard about the state of good repair backlog, and this budget, for many, when they hear 9%, is going to feel like a stretch. We're stretching, we're asking for more, but at the same time, we are really just maintaining a mediocre standard that's not actually excellence, because we can't get there unless we actually make meaningful reductions in the state of good repair. Would you say that that is true, that this is not the excellence that we aspire to, but we're still stretching just to maintain this?
Through the chair, I think I can say state of good repair is one of my primary concerns here in the city. And I think those of you that have worked with me for a while know that that's an area that we continue to focus on and continue to bring strategies forward to be able to address. I was proud of the fact that we were able to add $1.8 billion to this budget, but then at the same time, challenged by the fact that cost escalation and additional challenges, even with that added investment, was seeing the number continuing to grow. We are fully committed to continuing to take actions to bring that number down, and we've highlighted a few of those in the presentation. The first is our single biggest SOGR liability is the Gardner. With the upload of that to the province, that is going to give us additional flexibility that will allow us to bring that number down and make it in those areas that we've seen significant growth, and that's in transit, that's in our city facilities, that's in our parks investments, and transportation infrastructure. So that is going to be a focus in an area. We're also embarking on two really critical initiatives that are going to help in that. One is we've got our team in financial planning that's advancing the work on our capital asset management plans, consistent with provincial regulations. That's going to go a far way in really directing when is that optimal time, the prioritized time to make investments in infrastructure to limit the growth. We're also building, and we mentioned this part of the long-term financial plan, a capital prioritization framework. The work on that is going to begin really now that the budget's landed tomorrow. So that is going to help direct how and when and where we make those critical investments, with the goal being that we're not just advancing SOGR, we're advancing the critical areas of SOGR to improve the city. So while I'm disappointed that you continue to see that number grow, I am confident that there's actions and efforts that we're going to continue to take to be able to bring that number down over time.
It just feels like we're bailing water. The ship is still sinking. It's exponential growth. And it does feel like a loan against our children, because at the end of the day, they inherit this incredible hole that we are not able to fix. But I wanted to just move on. You know, there are people who hopefully have tuned in from across the city, and the term structural deficit is not necessarily widely understood, but it's actually built in that when you enter the city and you look at the budget, we face a structural deficit, and that's coming out of the gate without us even doing anything. Can you explain in layman's terms, what is a structural deficit?
Yeah, sure. And I'll have to kind of put my hat back on from the budget consultation sessions, because I know this was something we discussed quite a bit at that time. At its core, we talk about the $17 billion in gross expenditures. So that $17 billion every year in a municipal budget will grow, no different than I think what the general public will see due to inflationary pressures. So you see that growth unique to the city and very much unique to Toronto. On top of it, you see growth in terms of added demand for our services. So that $17 billion not just grows annually from inflation, it grows because there's added demand and for supports and city services. Well, our property tax base is our primary source of revenue, and our property tax base cannot grow at that same level. And unlike the federal, municipal, or provincial governments, we don't have revenue tools that grow with the economy and grow with that added demand or with that inflationary. And what that does is it means, well, our property tax base grows, at roughly, what is approved by every council every year, or modest assessment grows, it can't keep up. And that growing delta between the two numbers is what we refer to as our structural deficit. And really, since the start of my time here at the city, it's been a challenge we've had to address. And what makes this year so much different is it's compounded by the sustained impacts of the pandemic. It's compounded by added inflationally pressures.
I want to squeeze in one more question.
I'll stop.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you.
And then we're going to do a time check.
Just one last question. We've seen across sectors, massive layoffs have come. Financial, grocery stores. I'm just wondering, in a time where so many people are cost cutting and we are making some changes, but it's not as visible because we are trying to maintain services. What are the areas that we have really tightened things up? Because I think a lot of taxpayers want to know, are we efficient in our expenditures? And how would they be able to assess that as a non-professional finance expert? How could someone look at our budget and understand, are we efficient with tax dollars?
Yeah, through the chair, and I'll start. So we had mentioned this year's budget that includes $620 million in reductions and offsets. While we did embark on the process with the goal and aim of preserving and maintaining services, we were looking in those areas to try to find opportunities to find those reductions and offsets. And we will have the programs coming in next week, and they can speak to specific actions that they've taken within their areas. But collectively, we've seen $180 million in savings through line-by-line actions alone. Even on the COVID and the pandemic impact side, working with programs in ways that they can either accommodate or address those actions outside of the transit and shelter pressures, we found a further $112 million. The program reviews, the exercise that we take with the programs as they initiate their submission process, we've identified $200 million in offsets and reductions through those activities. The long-term financial plan or actions we've taken, there's $30 million reflected in this year's budget that's expected to grow over the next few years. We've talked about the limited service reductions, that we've got some savings in there. So there is a series and suite of actions that we've taken, and we've taken them with the goal and the aim of still looking to maintain and protect services. And we'll be happy to discuss those at the program level next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Morley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you to staff. A lot of great questions have already been asked and answered by my colleagues, and I know we're all looking forward to the opportunity to connect with our divisions and agencies directly next week. I think for me, I'm just sort of curious because for those of us who've been watchers of City Hall over the years or have been staff around this space, we know that the challenges around our budget year over year have been significant and have been vocalized by staff and members of council. And so with the proposed property tax increase for this upcoming budget year, how do we compare against other cities of our size, and where do we sort of land in the mix? I know there's a slide about it in the presentation, but I think it's really important context for residents to really grasp as we move forward.
So through the chair, the difficulty with cities of our size is we're the 4th largest in North America, and our comparators have a very different regime of how they raise revenue. They do have a combination of property tax and growth-related taxes. And so while it's hard to accurately compare US cities to Canadian cities for a variety of reasons, the reality is that we face challenges in how we raise the types of revenues that cities of our size globally do not. We face challenges in the way that we fund things like social housing and transit that other cities of our size do not. And so if you were to take even those few measures, access to growth-related services, where in terms of the levels of government, things like social housing reside, and how a transit system for the size and scope of a city like Toronto, how that's funded and managed and governed, those alone would have a significant change. As Steve mentioned, in talking with my colleagues in municipalities in Ontario, all are saying they are taking to their councils increased budgets beyond which their councils have been used to. These conversations are happening. Now, the rate at the end of the day may not be the same as what we're talking about here in Toronto, but the increases are significant and challenging, and in some cases, the rates are very similar. So that's the story. Unfortunately, for a city the size of Toronto, Canadian context, we're unable to compare, but it gives you a sense of why we continue to push some of those other messages to the provincial and federal government, because that's how we become more comparable to large cities around the world.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. And just to continue sort of down that road, to pull that thread a little bit more, we know that this is an unprecedented pressure, but we've had pressures in the past. And I just wondered if you could speak to us a little bit about how our approach this time around, with a real value-centered budget and a real honest look at the pressures and challenges that our mayor and my colleagues on council have tried to provide direction for, has changed our approach to budgeting this year compared to previous years.
So through the chair, I will say the one thing that hasn't changed is really looking at a value-based approach to it. We've done that in the past, and we've also looked at a prioritization so that when we do come forward, we can answer your questions to say, well, how did you decide in an enhancement here versus an enhancement there? I can tell you that every single division and programs within division would, if asked, say, hey, here's where an enhancement would work. And so that prioritization is important. What's different is that we started more than a year ago to be very clear in a scientific, in terms of the data that's behind it, but in a practical and long-term approach to say it isn't possible to solve these issues in 1 year. It isn't practical to say, well, we'll just do a couple of things and it will magically solve itself. It's about setting ourselves on a course and on an action. And this really becomes year one of that. The challenge becomes that we had a few extra things that timing is everything. I mean, previous city managers and CFOs have talked about this for years and didn't have the compounding challenge of how do we absorb COVID-related impacts? How do we do the other things that we've talked about? So I think what's different is that we've had to deal with some extraordinary challenges that haven't been there in the past. But what's really, it was a very good moment for Steve and I, not when you just accepted and endorsed the long-term financial plan because it was a staff report, but because of the way each of you spoke to the need for us to focus on this type of work and the need for us to take that long-term view. And, in municipal life, that's not always the way life works. And so kudos to you. And I think kudos to the way this got set up to deliver in terms of what is it going to take over multiple years to get us to where we need to go. And the last thing I'll say on this, and I know I've burned through your time, so I hope you get a second round to ask anything else you had. But I do want to say that this was really the only way we can talk about sustainability was to take a much longer view of this. And so that's why I have some confidence. There will be some rough moments. Whether we've Whether we've presented, fully accurately what will work for you this year is what these next few weeks will be about. And then you will also reflect on what the mayor brings forward as she presents her proposed budget. So this is always a dialogue and a discussion. But I think what we all agree on, and I've heard it from you as we've talked individually, is that no one is suggesting for a minute that we can deal with it this year or next year and just make it go away, that this is about a long-term commitment, and that's what we start.
Okay, and since you introduced the idea of a second round, let's do a time check. I still have my vice chair, Councillor Perks, is next on the list. But just to be clear, I know I know how long committee meetings can go, but our intention was to be able to. We need these guys to be able to be available for a technical briefing of the members of the media at some point in the near future. And I'm assuming they're going to need 15 minutes. So I have Vice Chair Perks. Can I canvass on a second round and see if it's possible that if we're having one, we get done quickly enough to give these guys a bit of a break and then move on to where the technical briefing leaves these exhausted guys available for that. Councillor Fletcher, is Councillor Crisanti still logged on?
I'm here, Chair.
Okay.
Yes.
So you indicated earlier if there's a second round, you want one, Councillor Fletcher? Okay. Are there any others? Okay. Councillor Chang? Okay. There are just a few. So if Councillor Perks goes next, then I really only have 3 for a second round. And if I leave it at that, then we can make these guys available later, and we have lots of opportunity. As I said this morning, there is more opportunity to engage in this budget than there has ever been in my 20 years.
Exactly.
So.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
I request that for a second round, maybe 3 minutes rather than 5.
I'm on my first round.
Well, Councillor Fletcher already said she just has a couple of questions. So to the best of our ability, we'll all be very concise with no preambles in our questions, and we'll see how that works. Councillor Perks.
So I've been reflecting on a couple things that you talked about. One is the change in process, and one is some of the holes that exist. In terms of the change in process, and this may be to Mr. Conforti, who's been here a while, for many years, it was the process that the mayor or council would send you a direction saying, bring in a budget below inflation. That went on for over a decade, didn't it?
Yeah, through my memory, there would usually be a budget directions report that would come to council. So there was a time when a budget directions report would come to council. There were also times where I believe it would be a letter or a direction
from the mayor,
directly. And budgets would be built based on those directions, either from council or directly from.
And instead of doing that this year, you went out and talked to people about what they wanted. That's where we got our budget direction, if you will.
A major difference that you would see in this year's budget that I haven't experienced in the 17 years I've been in the city is we did pre-budget consultation. So, we would routinely have deputations or even budget town halls after we've launched the budget. The difference this year is we went out and had 16 sessions across the community on pre-budget consultation.
So in those years when you were getting letters from mayors, they generally would say 0 or below inflation or something like that. So I think in 2011 we had 0, in 2014 we had 1.5, in 2016 we had 1.7 or something like that. And those were well below inflation. What did those decisions to not keep our revenue up to inflation, how has that contributed to the hole we're in now?
Well, I think it's fair to say, the ability to build the property tax base is going to be dependent on past decisions that were made overall. I do think, and just reflecting back on, I believe, the 2011 years or so, there were also reductions in certain services. And I know in many of those instances, those would have come back in future years and put additional pressure on the budget and additional pressure against actions that would have had to taken, or how growth we would have seen in land transfer tax revenue would have been directed, rather than it being potentially directed to capital investments or other actions that we've taken more in the recent term that would have had an impact across not just our operating but our capital program.
And to the city manager, along similar lines, I've been around for several conversations with other orders of government about, we need you to toll the gardener or this or that or some other way to help us. Have you ever heard them come back to us and say, why should we give you money when you keep cutting your own taxes?
Through the chair, no.
No? Oh, that's what they say to me.
I haven't heard that directly, but yeah, I'm sure it's out there.
Have you heard from other governments, though, that they feel that the city needs to do its part?
So through the chair, absolutely. I think what's changed a bit in the conversation, not the same length of time with the City of Toronto, but I've been in municipalities now for a little bit of time, is there is a realization that you can't slough the whole thing off anymore, that this is about how we're going to work together. And I do think there is actually a renewed desire to look at how that is working together. I think no one quite knows how to make that happen, because everybody also wants to protect their own ability to do their own priorities. But I think cities are reaching a point at which there is no way to say, go away and solve it yourself. Yes, they want cities to step up and do their part, and the same is true with the City of Toronto. But the corollary to that is an expectation that something else needs to change. And I think we saw a little glimpse of that in the provincial New Deal.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, then that is everyone's first round. Councillor Crisanti, you had a couple of extra questions?
Yes, sorry, I just had to,
Super.
to unmute myself. Here I am. So thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity for just a couple more questions. And so, Mr. Conforti, I just wanted to go back to a comment I heard earlier in your presentation, and which is really clearly no one's happy with a 10.5% tax increase. I certainly am not. But I did hear that you were able to find $600 million in savings. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. We've found included in this budget was $620 million in savings, reductions, and various offsets.
So on that piece, congratulations. That's phenomenal work. During the process of coming up and looking for these savings, did you have to cut any services to come up with this number?
Through the chair, again, the aim in developing this budget was to look at avenues and opportunities to manage the challenge over a 3-year period in a way that could allow us to preserve and maintain services. As our city manager noted, and I had noted in the presentation, there was one, I think, primary example, which was the windrow clearing, where we are implementing a service reduction. There are some changes to user fees. There are some efficiency measures that are included in the budget. For the most part, I believe that's the only substantial or significant change in service that you'd see included in our budget.
So I think I know the answer to this, but do you think, Mr. Conforti, that you've taken this as far as you can in terms of finding savings? If you were asked to go back and look for another $200 million in savings, which will equal about approximately a 5% potential reduction in taxes, because I believe 1% equals to $40 million. So what would you say to that?
Through the chair, to move on, in addition to the $620 million we've already captured, that couldn't be achieved without looking at services and service levels.
All right, it's quickly on the 6%, sort of black cloud, hovering over us, which is, it will be a terrible day in the city if we implemented an additional 6%, only because the federal government isn't at the table negotiating seriously and coming up with sustainable funding to help us with what we need, at that level. So between now and then, what is the plan between now and the 14th of Feb? Will your team be at the table every day with the federal government to ensure this does not happen?
So through the chair, the short answer is yes, doing that both at the staff level and the political level. I can tell you there are conversations that they're well aware of the need, and there are ideas that are being floated around. It has to get landed very, very, very soon. None of us want to see the reality that you described having to be the way that we move forward.
Thank you. So I know I don't have a lot of time. On another note, emergency services. Through this budget, were you able to accommodate all the requests on the budgets with respect to emergency services when it comes to paramedics, fire, and Toronto Police?
Through the chair, so obviously we would have continued to work and develop our budgets along with the city programs, paramedic services, and Toronto Fire. And what you see in front of you is a budget that reflects that collaborative effort. It also includes funding that continues to be able to advance the hiring plans on paramedics and fire services. We also have been very engaged with the police service and their finance staff. What you see forward in our budget, and they'll be able to speak to it next week, is a budget that includes an additional $25 million in property tax funding towards the police services budget. The budget also identifies different efforts and actions that we've taken to support the police service. I will note, and it's important to be clear on this, the budget that the staff are tabling today is different from the budget that was approved by the Police Services Board. The difference between the two budgets is roughly $12.6 million, where our budget does include an unspecified reduction being requested of the police service compared to the budget that was approved by the board.
Okay, so.
Sorry, I need clarification on that. You said the Toronto Police budget that you're approving is $12.5 million less than what they're requesting.
So Councillor Crisanti, as the CFO outlined, he has answered that with respect to the overview and the presentation and the high level, but very clearly ours includes a $25 million increase. They would like $12.6 million on top of that. But I wonder if we want to do a deep dive on this, if we could do that in the division by division review, because next week the police chief or deputy chief will be here and could go right into the detail. Yeah.
Happy to do it.
Okay, super. Councillor Fletcher?
Thank you. Just a quick one when I was from last time. So in the budget, we're accounting for whatever we have to spend on FIFA that was signed off. Is that anywhere in here or not? 200 to 300 million.
So through the chair, yes, whatever was laid out in the budget for 2024 would have been included in there, and there is some capital as well as operating.
Thank you. Councillor Perks really twigged me with his questions, which had to do with the number of budgets below inflation. And I think there's only 3 of us that were there in 2010 and then 2014. There's so many new people, in really understanding what they were might be very helpful for everybody. So and sorry, Anthony, yes, you were there too. So there's not a lot of us, but it's a very important issue to understand if we're talking about every budget's built on past, as you've told us, past decisions. So what were those past decisions and what were those numbers that were approved? I don't know if you can all read them out or if we could just get that at some point. Do you have that list?
I've got a list. It's a pretty comprehensive list that goes back to 1998. It might be more efficient for me to find another form to present.
If you can find a way just to show us what that was and our understanding that those aren't our decisions today, but those were decisions of previous mayors and previous councils. And then as well, I think, again, on the city building fund, not many of us were here when that was set up under Mayor Ford in order to have money specifically go to the Scarborough subway. So I'm going to assume that some of the 1.5 is always directed to the Scarborough subway, or it's now in a larger basket?
Yeah, and just for distinction, it is two separate baskets. So the Scarborough subway levy came in advance of the city building.
Yes, I was there.
Yeah, and it's separate and distinct. So that was 3 years of increases. It was 0.5, 0.5, and 0.6. That now generates annual funding that is set aside and put into the Scarborough Levy Reserve, where we have council direction to ensure we're committing those funds against the Eglinton East LRT extension.
So how much is in the Scarborough Levy Reserve?
We can pull that data. I don't have it in front of me. Anthony may have it.
And through the chair, annually the city collect Scarborough subway extension levy about $40.6 million.
And since it was established?
Yes, and then this revenue goes straight to the reserve to fund the future Scarborough LRT expansion.
So what's the total amount?
We'll get the exact dollar amount.
I have to get the amount from so I have to get back to you.
So there's a
on
very large Scarborough Reserve for transit in Scarborough. And then the decision in 2022, well, not by this council, by a previous mayor, was to establish the 1.5, bake it in, and set it for the future for 10 years.
Yes, and those funds have been collected, and again, those are separate and distinct from the Scarborough subway
I
amounts.
understand. So thank you for clarifying that. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Chang, you had a couple extra questions?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to confirm, so if you have a...
Sorry, which is the second round?
Oh, okay, I'll done.
I do have you on the list, but you're after Councillor Chang? Yeah. Oh, sorry. For the second round, I'm just going by hands when they came in, because some of you had left your chairs and were wandering around. So I'm just going in the order of show of hands. Thanks. But we are getting into a time constraint, so keep it concise, folks, including the answers.
Can I reset my time, please? Yeah. Okay, so if you have a home that's worth $700,000, this increase would mean $321 increase for the year. Is that correct?
Yes, and I believe that's reflective of the operating rate increase, the 9% increase on the operating.
Right. So on the capital side, is there also an amount that people will have to absorb?
Yeah,
Like,
so
is there a calculation per household for that?
Yeah, it's indicated on slide 31, and it's noted at $53.
$53 per year?
Yes.
Okay. So that will be, close to $400 for a household per year with this increase. Is that correct?
Through the chair, correct. And for completeness, also adding in the two rates as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one thing that is hard to capture is the impact of the loss of Section 37. So we've talked about the impact of DCs in this report, but Section 37 used to and contribute to community centers, daycares, parks, and not having Section 37 being reduced to 4% does have a real impact on our ability to build that infrastructure to support the growth that is being created. So is there a way that we can, because while we were promised that we would be made whole after Bill 23, I'm not sure that that wholeness includes that loss of Section 37. So I'm wondering if there has been any attempt to tease out a number of financial impact in our ability to build really important infrastructure.
Through the chair, so again, the commitment to be made whole was very much specific to the changes as it related predominantly to the development charges. The changes as they relate to Section 37 and moving to the community benefit charge had predated the Bill 23 announcement that impacted development charges. There has been no commitment on making us whole. There was a report that I believe we developed probably around 18 months ago or so that highlighted the amount of Section 37 funds we would have received on an annual basis in comparison to our projections and estimates on community benefit charges. And I don't have the exact delta off the top of my head, but it was substantial, and it obviously had an impact on our overall growth funding tools.
So there is a number that we don't see right now, and it's our ability to contribute in a meaningful way from development into infrastructure. And it's not in this report, but it's there. And every time I sit down with a developer and try to get a daycare or get a contribution to things, and I'm capped at 4%, I hit that wall. So is there a plan moving forward to capture that gap? Because it really is affecting our ability to have growth support growth in our city.
So I think you're hitting on one of the challenges that we've raised as we discuss our growth funding tools, and it is the fact that while there is a principle that growth pays for growth, the reality in the city is that it does not. And the funds that we capture through added density, added development, are not adequate to be able to offset the costs that we have, both predominantly on capital, to be able to support that added density. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge that exists in our capital program. And you see it when we present unfunded needs, and you see it when we present growth-related requirements.
So I'm just going to pivot to one last question. Sure. In 2022, we had a $484 million shortfall related to COVID. In 2023, it was $933 million. And it seems to me that every year there is a need to go to higher orders of government saying, we are desperate, we need you to fill this hole. This year, we're saying to the federal government, 200 million so that we can get the other 200 from the province. How much did they kick in for last year's 933 million shortfall?
Through the chair, and I do think it's an important distinction between the COVID impacts and the refugee response actions that we're taking. As it relates to COVID impacts, unlike prior years, there is no more COVID funding supports. In terms of the 933 million, in the latest variance report, I do believe we've identified funds associated with our public health efforts. There was some kind of rollover funding, I believe, that we might have had within some of the other areas within the city. But for the most part, I believe our residual shortfall is about $818 million. So that $818 million is almost entirely depleting the COVID backstop. And that's how we're bringing forward and maintaining a balanced budget in 2023. The approach in 2024, which is very different from the last 3 or 4 years, is we are no longer building a budget that assumes funding coming in to support those impacts. And the message that we had provided to all of our divisions and agencies is, as you build your 2024 budget, we need to identify the sustained impacts of the pandemic and transition those costs to the tax base.
So the new normal now includes what you were
really
quoted.
need you to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so Councillor Prutza, I need you to do the last of the second round, and then we really got to receive this puppy.
I just want to.
Go ahead.
I just want to follow up on something that a line of thinking that some of my colleagues have got taken us on. So on page 22 of your presentation, right, you got this beautiful graph, so simple and neat looking. You got a Canada flag representing the federal government. You got a provincial flag representing the provincial government. You got a municipal flag, and then you got some numbers. Just explain that graph in a little more detail for us, please.
Through the chair, yeah, this was a graphic that we used as part of the budget consultation process, and it was also developed as an extension of the long-term financial plan work we did. It identifies of all the taxes and fees paid to municipal, federal, and provincial governments, the amount of those that goes either to the federal government, the provincial, or the municipality.
Okay, when municipalities, you mean the City of Toronto here, because it's the City of Toronto flag, right?
We're showing it as the City of Toronto, but this is
not
uniform.
Mississauga,
This is uniform across
not Wawa. We just want to make sure. Okay, so what this graph seems to suggest is that Torontonians, and I just want to know if it's a fair characterization, that Torontonians pay a substantial amount of taxes. We just don't get enough back.
So through the chair, substantial amount of taxes are paid. The only caveat I'd say is, so the direct portion that comes to cities in the City of Toronto is marginal. We can't discount, though, that some of what's paid to provincial and federal governments does come back. Our education system, our healthcare system, and others.
No, of course.
So just that's the caveat I'd say. But yes, in terms of what we can identify and use for our own purposes, it is a tiny minority of the overall taxes that Torontonians pay.
Okay. So would it be a fair characterization, would it be a fair statement to say this, that just following this line of thinking that somehow in 2010 we'd increase property taxes and we're in a bad situation now because it was 0 plus 0 plus 0? And would it be fair to say that if we doubled or tripled or quadrupled our property taxes, that the provincial and federal governments wouldn't come in and say, oh, golly, shimbas, guys, you guys have been increasing property taxes to the gazoo. Here, let us give you a share of the income tax for you guys to take on your way to the shopping mall. Like, would that not be a fair characterization to say that you could raise property taxes as far as you want, you won't get an extra nickel, it doesn't increase your bargaining position with the province or the feds? For additional revenue tools or revenue sources, or, yeah? Wouldn't it be
I think,
naive?
Councillor, you have asked the question, but I need you to now,
That's the
rather
question.
than state it, even though it actually
Get
is
animated.
kind of outside the presentation we're
No,
supposed
it's
to be
right here.
asking questions of. Well, you're a little off the slide and into the politics of it. So let's let them answer
I'm just
as
following
best
up
they
on-
can.
I'm following up on questioning that you
But
allowed
as
others
we're
to
going
do.
that far, we got there. Let's let them answer.
Sure.
So through the chair, I do believe that all levels of government recognize there's always a threshold of each level's ability to tax and what it would be. I don't hear that, municipalities just go tax at an exorbitant level and that's how you solve your troubles. So I think there's always a balance. Other orders of government expect us to do our part. And a bit back to Councillor Perk's point, I mean, I know that the rhetoric's out there, it's not said directly to me, is they're not going to come in so that Toronto can have a 0 tax increase on property taxes, because there are services that are the municipal responsibility and we should be figuring out ways to raise the revenue for it. The challenge for cities, and in particular cities like Toronto, is when you look at the full basket of services, we are providing and need to provide services that go well beyond the ability of the property taxpayer to cover those expenses. If it was simply put into some of those very traditional municipal services, we might be able to manage it ourselves with reasonable property tax increases. But when you look at running a transit system the size of Toronto, when you layer on the need for social housing at the size of Toronto, there is no possible way that you could ever suggest that a property tax base is the source that you would go to. And that's where that balance needs to be restructured.
Correct.
Last question.
So we increased taxes, property taxes, 7.5% last year. We're going to increase them 10.5% this year. And the federal government is still saying to us, we're not, it hasn't come to the table with $250 million for essentially for refugee shelter, their responsibility. So our increasing those property taxes hasn't brought them to the table willy-nilly, willing to say, hey,
Question
guys.
in there? I'm sorry, but everyone has been really good.
Hasn't worked,
not
has it?
preambling to get through the second round.
Yeah.
We're in a time.
The question is, hasn't worked, has it?
So through the chair, we are awaiting the federal response. Absolutely. So that piece remains outstanding. I think what did work and we saw in the fall is a different conversation and different result from a provincial perspective.
Okay, so councillors, just quickly on process, because I want to make sure people understand we are accessible. Today, we're just going to move receipt because we want to make the staff available. This is the staff proposed budget to go to the technical briefing. But at the 16, 17, and 18 meetings, we will go round by round through divisions. You're going to see it in the agenda. And there will be time then to actually move the motions for your briefing note requests and say speeches if you want. That all starts on the 16th. And of course, your process with the community starts right now. So on that note, you will see it all by going to the budget page online. And all we have left to do is receive this first presentation from my vice chair. A motion to receive. All in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Welcome very Welcome back. And I hope you've had the chance to get some coffee and refresh from this morning. We're here to talk about the 2024 budget media briefing. My name is Lindsay Broadhead. I'll be your moderator today. With me are colleagues City Manager Paul Johnson and Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer Stephen Conforti. Today's briefing is to provide any clarification you need on the presentation that Paul and Stephen delivered this morning at Budget Committee, but in addition to anything else that may be coming up. If you can bear with me for just a couple of minutes of a few details to run through. First of all, for division-specific questions, you've been given a full outline of the schedule that will take place on the 16th, 17th, and 18th. So please refer to that, and that is really when we're hoping to go into divisional related items in a deep dive format. If you have questions that cannot be answered today, please let us know. Reach out to the media alias and we will try to follow up with you in short order. The budget launch presentation slide is posted on TIMIS in the meeting agenda. The budget notes and briefing notes will also be posted there by 4 p.m. today. The agenda also contains links to all budget notes, as well as the 10-year capital plans and budget. The same documents will be available on the city's 2024 budget plans and budget web pages later today. Today's news releases, backgrounder, and all related media-related information, if you don't already have it, will be available at toronto.ca/media. And to ensure that you each have a chance to ask questions, we're going to follow usual format, which is 2 questions, 1 follow-up, and then we'll pass to your colleagues. And of course, you could hop back into the queue. I'll take the last question today at 1:45 or so. So with that, let's start. First question. Oh, Oliver, go ahead.
City of Toronto is often described as having the lowest property tax in the region. I don't think it's 100% accurate. I think it's the second lowest, maybe third lowest. If this property tax goes through as proposed, where would Toronto be within the region in its level of property tax?
We would need to see where all the other councils land. So part of that is through the budget processes of all the municipalities in the GTHA. We'd have to see how that plays out. A lot are still going through the process. We are. What was identified in the long-term financial plan by Ernst & Young is that if we were to get to that, medium point within the GTHA, we're talking about a 10 to 12% gap there. And we expect this year would take into account that. The goal was never to do that in 1 year, because that would be on top of whatever, base increases others were doing. So, we are a little bit below our comparators, not the lowest by far, but a little bit below. And our goal will be to continue to do our part in Toronto, and it starts this year.
When you say below, you mean that's property tax and wastewater, and that's the whole package. That's not just property tax.
So that's the other piece that delays our analysis a little bit, is that not all municipalities treat the way they collect taxes and fees the same way. I come from a municipality, for instance, where waste was included within the property tax increase, and in Toronto, that's a separate rate. So we do need to do that analysis to be sure that we're comparing apples to apples. The final piece is we are the only municipality in this area that has the municipal land transfer tax, and again, that's harder to allocate across everyone, because maybe not everybody in their lifetime would experience that, but it is another piece of the puzzle. So it isn't as easy as saying, here's the property tax increase and here's what happened in Hamilton or in Peel region or whatever. It's a little more complicated, but we continue to monitor those, and it was helpful in the long-term financial plan for Ernst & Young to clarify exactly what that gap looks like when you take into account all the ways that we collect fees and taxes here in Toronto.
The budget chief was laying out the average cost that would go up for the average homeowner is about $33, I think, or price of a cup of coffee or whatever. But could you just sort of lay out yearly of the 10.5%, so including the 9 and the 10.5, what would be the average homeowners? What number would the average homeowners bill be going up by? In it, just a dollar figure.
Sure. So on the 9% property tax increase on an average home would be $321 in terms of the annual increase. We then also talked about the water rate and the solid waste rate increases at 3% each. On the water rate, based on an average of 230 cubic meters of water, would be an additional $30. Solid waste is dependent on your bin size, but it would be anywhere from $9 to $16. And then the city building fund would be a separate $53 on the average residential.
And if it goes up to that 16.5 nightmare scenario that you're trying to avoid, what is the dollar figure there?
So if that were the case, that would likely be around another $200 on the average home.
And what was the average cost, like total, last year for the average home?
The average property tax? Sure, so just give me a moment, pull the exact figure.
While Stephen's looking, may I ask journalists to say their name and outlet before they ask a question? Thank you.
So we have the average amount for 2024. The average amount for 2024 is expected to be $3,940 on the average assessed home at just under $700,000. It's also important to note that assessment values on properties have not changed in the last few years while we're still waiting for MPAC to resume assessments.
Can I just clarify, is that figure the 9%, the 10.5, or like including solid waste, like what is included in that?
So that's strictly the property tax. So that would represent the 9% on the operating, would also reflect the city building levy. The solid waste rates and Toronto water rates are the separate utility charge, would not be part of the property tax bill.
10.5.
Yes. Excuse me.
Paul, you said during the committee that staff weren't necessarily recommending that 6% increase of the federal I know you said there's some ways that how you can mitigate that impact. Can you elaborate a bit on that, or what are some potential alternate strategies to avoid that 6%?
So I think, the 6% is assuming, A, we're going to keep the level of service where it is and continue to do that in the absence of any federal partnership. Secondly, that there will be no federal partnership. And I find that to be hard to believe, that there will be absolutely no federal partnership on refugees and asylum seekers. Recognize that this goes back a number of years in Toronto, never to this size, but Toronto has always had a partnership with the federal government to recover costs for these programs. It used to be in the 55 to 65 million range on an annual basis, and they were there. We were reimbursed to about 96% of our costs, which was a good partnership. So I think it's unlikely there is zero partnership. Secondly, we could look at the level of program that we're delivering. We've always said to the federal government, we are here and we are the best deliverers of this service in a partnership model. But at some point, we'd have to say, how much can we really sustain doing this on our own? And then the final piece was we could look at other alternatives. If this was a short-term fix we were looking at, there might be ways that we could reallocate funds in some other way. So I think it's fair to say that that's one way that you would bridge that gap. And it's instructional, I think, for Torontonians to understand its impact, because not always, do people like us, we keep in our heads all what 1% means and all the rest. It would be the equivalent to a 6% tax increase. It's not necessarily the only way we can go about it, but in the worst case scenario, that would be one option. Right, the number of people on a night-by-night basis that are sheltered. We have a number within our base shelter system, and we actually have opened a number of others and are funding other types of programs beyond the base shelter system that we operate on a year-by-year basis. And in the past, we've also reimbursed some costs for places like churches that have stepped up. So, we could decide to look at just how much we're able to sustain from a human resources perspective, from a partnership with agencies perspective, as well. It's important to note that we're there. We want to be a partner in this work, but we don't control the policy framework for this. We do not direct the operations, nor does the city of Mississauga or the Regent of Peel at the airport at Pearson. And yet, here we are having a response. Well, I can't see many other programs where we would say, well, that's an endless amount. What if that number becomes 7,000 or 10,000 in the years to come? I think at some point we'd have to think about the service. So in the unthinkable scenario where we receive no support and are told federally that there is no support coming, and that those who arrive in Toronto need to be supported by the City of Toronto, I think we would have to look at what that level of service that we could provide on a sustained basis would look like.
Follow up on Pat's question, Qureshi from City News. It's just completely evaporated, but I'll go to another question. So the Canadian Taxpayer Federation says that the average price of a home in Toronto is just over $1 million, and that the property tax hike would result in a little over $700 a year for the average homeowner. And I just want to know why there's a discrepancy between the two numbers.
So I can take it. So we are looking at the average assessed value. The average assessed value at this point in time is roughly $700,000. Very different than what the acquisition of a new property may be. Again, MPAC has paused all of their assessment changes that generally happen every 4 years. So there would be a lag in the actual assessed value of property, for which is the number we leverage the property tax increase against.
Sorry, when was the last time though? Sorry, Tina and Danny with City News.
Yeah.
When was the last time that was done?
2016, I believe. 2016, I believe.
So I just remember my follow-up. So just with the federal government, the PG funding, you're not looking for actual, it doesn't have to be actual dollars, you're just looking for a commitment to know where they're going with it, correct?
Yeah, correct. It's unlikely that there's going to be a program-related announcement that says, here's a funding we're going to do and enter into a partnership. We've not had that in the past. In the past, we've applied to a fund that's available. And as I say, the average, and as we looked at 16, 17, 18 prior to the pandemic, was that 96% of our costs that we submitted were reimbursed. And that was through their interim housing assistance program, which we call IHAP. That program ended in March of 2023. It was restarted in terms of municipalities being able to access it in the summer when the crisis really hit. But that was a temporary measure, and we need access to that. So as long as we know that we can work with the federal government, we are not asking them to pick up the costs of other types of services that we provide from a homelessness perspective. We're asking that for those that are clearly identified in that category, that we have an ability to be reimbursed for our shelter costs as the City of Toronto, just like we've been doing for many, many years. So again, we're not asking for something new to happen. They've done this before. I understand federally that this is a bigger issue for them as well, but welcome to our reality that we're seeing on the ground.
Sure, just give me a moment. So within, we have identified $620 million in total. Again, as we mentioned at Budget Committee today, the aim in developing the budget was to preserve and maintain services. So aside from the windrow, which we pointed out, there really is limited changes in actual service levels. In terms of where we found those savings, those were either through efficiencies or budget review practices that we undertake, as well as different offsets we may have available. So a significant portion of that was line-by-line review work that we do every year as part of a budget process. I believe the number there was about $180 million. There was work we did with programs and being able to absorb and accommodate any of their sustained COVID impacts outside of transit and shelters. There was different program reviews that we would undertake when budget submissions would come in from our different programs or agencies, and we would review the information that was presented and opportunities to continue to maintain and deliver those services. So there was a series of actions that we would have taken to be able to total that $620 million. Yeah, and we'll have more detail in the specific budgets that are going to come forward. But I know that in certain programs, there may have been, trying to think, let me dig into the numbers. I'll probably pull out a few examples I can share.
Examples in the past that have been quite successful and continue, and in fact were identified in the long-term financial plan, is around procurement. So we actually do some bulk buying now from a medical supply perspective, which of course we use in both our long-term care, paramedics, and all the rest. That has saved significant dollars. So it's those types of actions and activities that we're looking at, and we will continue to expand. The other piece is contract management. So we've been putting more resources from a divisional perspective into contract management, and that is just making sure that we are extracting the maximum value from our contracts, and obviously not incurring any additional costs from those contracts that are unwarranted.
Paul, Sean Jeffrey, CBC News, just wanted to ask you about
the Ernst & Young report, you mentioned the idea of the tax increases that included in that report, the median impact of the MLTT. It also contemplates a pause if a large tax increase is introduced. I'm wondering if that was discussed by staff at all or considered in light of the numbers we're looking at today.
A pause on?
A gradual implementation, so a phased approach to a large tax increase if it were to happen.
Yeah, so, I think that's where we're headed with the multi-year approach to this. I mean, we have two challenges. One is that, which in isolation sounds wonderful, but the other piece is we have to present a balanced budget. So you don't get all the luxuries of saying, well, we'll phase this in, like sometimes you do in terms of large tax increases, phase it in from a property perspective. We had to find a soft point that allowed us to balance before we would have to look at service reductions. And so, thankfully, the New Deal took us away from the brink. There was almost no way that we could have a viable property tax increase if we didn't get the New Deal with the province signed off on. So that was helpful. We felt that at this level, it didn't need to be phased in, but we are taking a 3-year approach right now, and we would encourage council to continue to be doing this forward planning and looking at it so that property owners can get a sense of what's likely to be there instead of waiting till the equivalent of January 10th each year to see what it is. They'll have a better sense of it as a property owner, and we'll have a better sense of it in terms of our budget planning.
So someone listening just out on the street there, if they were to hear that answer, should they take from that this is just the first year of, frankly, a multi-year process that can be quite painful when it comes to tax increases?
So the relative pain is an individual experience. Our goal is certainly not to be at this level regularly. We had, this was the pinch point year, and mainly because we had to figure out a way of absorbing in those COVID-related expenses, and it's either, there's not many ways you can go about that. And did we feel we could get there with a tax increase? We felt that we could put forward for consideration a tax increase that would allow that. That's not certainly our expectation moving forward, that we would be at these types of levels, all things being equal. And as Steve mentioned this morning in his comments, we are really looking at all those ways that we can be in a much better position and get back to a much more traditional opening pressure each year, which tends to be in that 550 million range, not in the 1.77 billion. So the short answer to your question is we are confident, and our planning is to see a diminished recommendation around property tax increase in future years.
Matt Elliott, City Hall Watcher. We heard a lot about the COVID backstop over the last number of years. Like, as of today, are we holding like a funeral for the COVID backstop? Is it zeroed out at this point, or is there any COVID backstop money in the operating budget?
Yeah, so I'm not going to mind stop talking about COVID backstop by the second quarter of this year. So as a result of last year's final spending, we do expect we'll have about 305 million left in the backstop. As part of our multi-year strategy, what we've done is we've taken that 305 million and we're fully depleting it. That is part of the bridging strategies that we're speaking to, and we're going to allocate that within this year's budget with the intent that through the actions that we're bringing forward that are going to take a few years to materialize, that backstop is then depleted in 2025, but then these other initiatives start coming in to take in that place.
Makes sense. Follow the reserves. What kind of reserve funds are still available to the operating budget? If, say, council wanted to find $16 million and look like a bunch of heroes, is that a viable strategy with the reserves that are available?
Yeah, so this is the reserves are a challenge in that most of them are obligated or committed against other purposes. And I know when we came forward with our reserve variance reports, we note that even with our reserve balance, there was more than $35 billion in commitments against those reserves over our operating budget and our 10-year capital plan. The example I like to give is our Toronto Water Reserve. We collect funds for the purpose of water use or water infrastructure use, and we might have over $1 billion in that reserve, but we have a capital plan that relies on $14 billion to be drawn from that reserve over the next 10 years that's predicated on annual contributions and rate increases. When we look across all of our reserves, that really holds true outside of a couple of small contingency reserves like extreme weather events, and those aren't reserves that you would use to balance operating asks. Those are there for an intended purpose to manage any unexpected events. So, The unallocated, I think, was maybe 250 million of total unallocated across all of our city reserves. And again, if council gave direction to draw from there, they could, but again, that would come at consequences against the purposes of those reserves.
Can I ask you just a clarification on how the new deal affects this year's operating budget? There was 300 million or so that was pledged, and then another 300 million that was going to be advanced this year for the transit and safety stuff for a total of 610, I think, but this budget shows about 382 million. There also seems to be, originally there was a projection of $100 million for the LRT operations, but now that looks like it's down to 75. So can you just elaborate on how that's going to end?
As Steve can take you through the numbers, so some of it is an amount that we know what year will come in. The other is it's that amount, but it's tied to things which aren't happening right away. So the LRT costs, for instance, are one of those examples. So the commitment is to the full 300 over the years, but it's staggered in because they're not going to allow us to use that funding for something else. And as you know, Finch and Eglinton haven't started yet. So that's why it's lower in year one, but it will not take away from the overall total by the end of the 3 years. But Steve can explain.
No, that's exactly it. So there's 4 components to the New Deal funding that are reflected in the operating budget. The 330 million that was identified for the operations of line 5 and 6 was exactly to Paul's point. We've allocated 75 million of the 330 in 2024. That matches against costs associated with preparing for and then operating those lines. The remainder of those funds continue to be held and will be leveraged in 2025 and 2026 as we continue to incur additional costs.
Right, and there was that $300 million
Yep.
for transit safety that was not in.
So that was, so it was 300 million. What we've done with that 300 million is we've allocated, or we're planning to allocate it, 100 million in 2024, a further 100 million in 2025, and again, the last 100 million in 2026.
Paul, can I just ask you about some of your nothing legal news. Can I just ask you about some of your pointed comments to the federal government this morning about the refugee and asylum funds? You said that they've known about this. I got a very boilerplate response back from the Ministry of Finance earlier that pointed out that Toronto is getting the most money from them that's been seen from any other federal government, and that this year they're paying into $4.2 billion across the country for asylum seeker housing. When you hear that response compared to the need that you're putting out there, what do you think?
So none of that is untrue. I don't know how that helps us today. So starting January 1st of 2024, we're about $700,000 a day, to which we have no leverage point in terms of how to recover those funds. We were not consulted in terms of how visas were provided or what planning and what knowledge of planning they had in terms of the increasing numbers of refugees or asylum seekers. We have no operational control in how things are happening at the airport or border crossings, or how they are working within their programs to alleviate single cities or single points of entry and helping our situation out. And yet when take away the budget, which we're talking about today, take it to the people. So our staff have no partnership model. We keep asking them to do more, open more, and deliver more. Our partner organizations are asked to do more because they're actually the experts in how to deal with this particular population. And then finally, the people themselves are caught with, we've just arrived here in this traumatic situation, and it all seems to be not very, very functional. So why I say, we've known for a long time there's a challenge. They know operationally it's a problem, and they're reflecting that because I know their costs are up across the country. So I've never for 1 minute suggested this is a Toronto-only issue when it comes to refugee and asylum seekers. But again, I simply look at it as the city of Toronto, and I look into the eyes of our staff, and I hear the stories from the field, and I say, I don't understand what that means. That's all interesting points, but we are still running a system way beyond what the city of Toronto ever anticipated for a population that needs our help and deserves our help, and we want to help. But at some point, You can't, even in a city with a $17 billion budget. And I know people sit there and they go, oh, you got a $17 billion budget. How can you possibly need this? $250 million is not something that the city of Toronto can just decide to move a few things around and be okay. This is not a positional piece where we're trying to extract some extra. We are asking to be a partner in the delivery. I don't need a guaranteed amount. If they want to look at a way that limits the number of people entering into Toronto, moving people to different communities so that it can be absorbed and people have a chance to achieve housing and other things faster, fantastic. So I've always said the number is in your control, but really the delivery is what you're asking the city of Toronto to do primarily in this case. And in that regard, because we've talked about this for a year, as we've seen the trends, because they were a part of the New Deal table where this was discussed explicitly at the table, and the timing was discussed at the table. I hope that this is just that they were slightly out of turn, and it's going to come in the next couple of weeks. But I point out that the provincial government's budget is on the same fiscal year. So this concept that, well, our budget is not at the same time as yours. Well, somehow the provincial government is flowing advanced funding around transit. They are recognizing their need to give us commitments prior to the launch of our budget. And I think we can get together on this. So again, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm simply saying from an operational perspective at the City of Toronto, we cannot sustain this. And if we're asked to do so, the impact on Torontonians is going to be beyond what I think they should absorb.
Do you have an idea for the current figure of total unmet capital needs?
Yeah, and I believe, so information is being prepared. I believe a briefing note will be prepared that will identify that total. I know last year we'd identified about $29.5 billion. We have just finalized all the budget materials, and the team is consolidating that figure. I do know that there were some additional challenges that were identified by the TTC as it relates to some of their climate initiatives, so the number has increased, but I'll need to see the final consolidated list that's being prepared now.
Last month at the Toronto Police Services Board, they had approved and voted on a $20 million increase for their budget. From what I understand, staff are suggesting less than that, but still an increase from last year. Could you just kind of break down the math there for us? I just want to make sure about the dollar terms I have it correct.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to one of the challenges that we're facing with the 2024 budget. So the work we've done with all our city programs and agencies is at the start of the budget process, we've asked that they would look at those sustained COVID impacts or those COVID impacts that were included in the 2023 budget. In the case of the police, and it's similar in the case with TTC or with shelter services, there was $17 million that was in their budget that had been tied to previous COVID impacts. The funding was included in the overall police budget, but the city had budgeted within our corporate accounts the assumption of federal or provincial funding supports. Heading into this year, with the change in our approach to budgeting and moving all of those costs to the property tax base, what we did with all city programs is we zeroed out those impacts. We said, you will need to, if those are sustained, you will need to re-ask for those funds because now we have to absorb them on the property tax side. So when the police came forward and identified 20 million, that was 20 million in addition to the funding that was provided in 2023. When we back out the funding that wasn't provided through the property tax base, and now we're looking at 25 million in additional tax funding, that's where the discrepancy exists. And I'm sorry if I confused you, if I kind of ran around a bunch of numbers there. At its core, the number that the police board approved compared to what the staff have tabled here at the city, the delta is 12.6 million. So our number is 12.6 million less than what the board approved, and it includes an unspecified reduction that we would ask the police to identify through the board. Compared to last year, it depends if you're looking at the gross budget or the net budget. As it relates to the net budget itself, we are adding 25 million in property tax funding. If you were to back out the 17 million in COVID, then that would equate to about 8 million or so. I will say, if you're looking at the total expenses, there were other actions that we took with the police We had established funds available in our major strategic reserve to be able to support their premium pay requirements. There were other budget strategies that we undertook with them to ensure that they could avoid cost. I think the other major element that is standard practice for the city, but when we're entering a bargaining year with our collective bargaining units, we don't include our provision for that funding within the program budgets. So when you're looking at the TTC's budget, the police budget, or the Toronto Fire budget, all three of those are in a collective bargaining year. They do not include any provisions for the collective agreement. We hold those in our corporate accounts. That will only get transferred once a settlement is reached. So in addition to the funding you would see there, we are holding back further funds.
Back to the question of state of good repair, I came up this morning during the meeting. Some Torontonians will be surprised that the property taxes go up 10%, and the state of good repair backlog is continuing to get worse.
Mhm.
So the city, you're gonna pay more, the city's gonna get trapped. We talked about multi-year, when does that turn around? When does the city start to get back?
So the intent is that we continue to make advancements. So while the overall SOGR backlog is growing, our actual investments in state of good repair are increasing by $1.8 billion. So through this budget, we are directing more dollars to state of good repair, which will have an impact. It's going to have an impact on our parks infrastructure, where we're making significant added investments in parks, as well as other major areas in the city where we have infrastructure. There's also a significant opportunity that exists as it relates to the upload of the Gardner. So right now, the Gardner is still included in our budget, but it's included assuming provincial funding. Once the due diligence process is completed and those project costs are uploaded to the province, that gives us the ability to free up $1.9 billion in existing city funding, with our priority to leverage that against infrastructure renewal needs. So again, that'll have a direct impact on our state of good repair. The other two major actions that I think are really important to note that you will see benefits in the coming years is we're undertaking a capital prioritization framework. This is not only going to help us make decisions around where we invest, but also when we invest. And when you couple that with the asset management work we're doing, it's going to ensure that while you may not see a change in the overall SOGR number, where we prioritize our investments is going to be for greatest impact, and greatest impact for those that are living, playing, visiting, working in the city.
And probably for Paul, you said this before, but take 5 steps back. This process during the $1.8 billion gap, leading us to today, asking the feds for money. Is this just not evidence of the difficulty of the problem of relying on property tax? I mean, we've said this before, but sum it up for the reader who hasn't heard this 50 times already. Why is the property tax the wrong way to fund the city? The wrong way to fund solar.
Right. So the property tax base just cannot generate the kinds of resources that are required to adequately fund the infrastructure of cities, to adequately fund the full breadth and depth of programs that cities are now delivering, and by extension of some of the provincial and federal programs enhancing so that we can have the kinds of communities we like. There's just no way. I mean, even in the city of Toronto, a 1% property tax increase is $42 million, and you've just seen our operating budget is $17 billion. So, and Steve put up that great slide. To tackle our opening pressure would be 42% tax increase. So it's the wrong way to do it. We need access, and certain programs need to be funded by growth-related programs. Certain programs needed to be funded by a pooling of all of the income and the purchasing that goes on. And that's the way we need to look at things. So there needs to be some of that structural work. Back to your question on SOGR, I mean, this is an eternal question for cities. If you look at where we've seen movement, it is a partnership of where resources come from other orders of government. The Toronto Community Housing is a great example. City of Toronto putting in $160 million a year over the 10 years, matched by a significant over $1 billion contribution over that period by the federal government. And you can see actually year by year how the Toronto Community Housing stock is actually getting better from a state of good repair. We're going to have to take it class by class in terms of classes of assets. That's what Steve talked about. But the property tax base is the wrong way to fund social programs. It is the wrong way to fund the infrastructure deficits that we have as cities. It needs to be there for those core operational services, the collection of garbage, the delivery of drinking water, some of the emergency services and responses that we have. If we did that and we had a different way of funding some of those other services, it'd be a whole lot more sustainable.
Was it in the the revenue base would be a little less than was projected in the report that you know last year. Can you clarify a bit like what the assumptions are for that part cost in terms of how much revenue it would be in next year and what exactly would apply to?
Yeah, and so it's a bit challenging right now. I think we've just got some high-level estimates that are built into our multi-year approach. For 2025, we wouldn't be assuming the full year. Like, there would be time for it to step up and scale up. Our staff are currently in the process of bringing forward a report consistent with council direction on what an implementation plan would look like. What would we charge? Where would we charge? What would exemptions be? What would the parameters be for that charge? So there's still quite a bit of work that's being developed. So for as of now, and for our modeling purposes, we leveraged the information that we had as part of the LTFP. Essentially, what you would see in 2025, if it's lower than what you would have seen, it's primarily because that would be based on about a half year of implementation. 60, is that what I'm hearing? It's about 60 million is about the half-year expectation. But again, I have to caveat, that's a preliminary estimate for planning purposes.
We talk a lot about residential rate as sort of the headline around here, but multi-residential rate is also going up, I think, the most in a long time anyway. That rate is already higher than the residential rate. Is there any analysis we can expect on what that will mean for tenants in apartment buildings? Can building owners pass that tax increase on in the form of rent increases?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it would depend on the agreement that you would actually have. I think there are actions that are in place to try to prevent essentially, passing on more costs, but it could potentially mean that there would be an increase in rent. I think to your earlier point, we had a freeze on those rates for quite a long time. In fact, there's a provincial regulation that determines what the ratio between your residential and your multi-residential would require to be. We've now reached that threshold, so through the actions that we've taken. So we're actually at a point in time where we would have no restrictions in bringing it forward at the full rate that we're recommending for residential. We have, and for the reasons that you just noted, brought it in and continue to bring it in at half of what our residential rate recommendation is.
Okay. And the assessment stuff, it's weird that we're still talking 2060 assessments in 2024, right? Have you done any analysis on how, I know it's revenue neutral
Yeah.
when reassessment happens, but like how would the tax burden shift if assessment were to happen now? Would it be, my sort of guess would be that it would mean that condo owners might pay less and single family homeowners might pay more, but is that, am I assuming too much?
It's hard to determine. I think it really depends, and it's not just the property type, it's the property class, it's the geographical area. So when you see the change in the assessments, they're going to look at what's changing in assessed value between the classes. So you'll see a shift between the classes. Within the classes themselves, they'll look at what's the change in assessment between regions in the city. So it's a pretty complex process that they undertake that really, to your point, it means no additional revenue to the city, but it does shift who's paying what across the city and between the classes.
Do you have any idea when the assessment might happen? You know, anything?
Not that I'm aware of at this time.
Just to follow up on Matt's question about multi-residential, are you at all concerned that the increase might trigger above guideline increases for tenants because of the size?
So, I think we're always concerned about the overall affordability. We're trying to walk a delicate line on the residential property tax increase, what we do with multi-res, what we do on the commercial side. Even things like the parking levy has been suggested, that might pass through and that's going to hurt the recovery of so it is a delicate balance of that. So we try and as Steve mentioned, I think we're at a point now where we could have done more. We're trying to find always that sweet spot of what the increase is that allows us to continue to function and deliver the service without, putting renters in this case at risk, or in the case of property owners who feel that they're sort of priced out of the ability to stay here. So the short answer is we're hoping that it's not at a level that would trigger widespread pieces of that. And the other thing I'll note is if this is going to be used as an example of why this might happen, there are many, many factors that go into that. So I would suggest that this isn't always the key factor in why those applications are made. And so that's I think where we stand on that.
Okay. Last question, please.
Perfectly timed. I love it. Okay, well, thank you very much. Just quickly a reminder of how the public can participate. I know we heard a bit about this morning. There are 3 evening telephone town halls on January 16th, 17th, and 18th. The Budget Committee will also hear feedback from residents and businesses in person and online on Monday, January 22nd and Tuesday, the 23rd. Speakers can register to speak by email at buc@toronto.ca. Comments can also be provided to the Budget Committee and members of Council in writing or by email. After listening to this feedback, all will be considered. The Budget Committee will meet for a final wrap-up meeting on January 26th, and the Mayor's budget will be released by February 1st. And City Council will hold a special meeting on February 14th, Valentine's Day, as the councillor mentioned this morning. News for media, the elevators are working, so you'll be able to transport your materials that way. And if you have any other questions, again, send your queries to the media at toronto.ca alias. Thank you so much. Thank you.
The instant impact and investment in SOG.
That's right. Done. Paid for. Thank you, Steve and Paul, and thank you all for your patience with us today. Cheers.
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please follow our social media platforms. And for more information, please visit our website.